Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this 8th of April meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee in Ealing. We have two main items on the agenda this evening. We have a call-in of the LSP cycle schemes report from the last meeting of the Cabinet to discuss, and we also have an update on Ealing Council workforce equalities, and we also, as it's our last meeting of the civic year, a very long 2019 to 2021 civic year, we need to discuss and agree topics for scrutiny panels in the next civic year. I haven't had, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Councillor Josh Blacker, Chair of OSC. Others will introduce themselves as we go through. I haven't had any apologies for absence. Sam, unless you've had any?
I've had apologies for lateness from Councillor Dubrovska. She should be with us in about half an hour. Great,
thank you. And there are no substitutions. I think some people are still coming in as Zoom kind of lets them in, but we will otherwise have no absences. Are there any declarations of interest from anyone? Councillor Bell.
Yeah, this is my usual one in terms of declaring my interest as a member of TfL's board, but also making it clear to the committee that I have recused myself from all decisions at TfL board in relation to funding to local authorities, including the active travel schemes, which we'll be discussing tonight.
Great, thank you. Any other declarations of interest from anyone? I don't see any hands up, so thank you. We don't have any.
Daniel.
Oh, sorry, Dan.
Sorry, I'm trying to start my video and it's not letting me start my video. Now it is.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, you've got a horrible grainy picture of me. I don't know if we have to declare this, but when we did previously, I declared that I live near but not in, and I don't own my property. So
I don't think so, Dan. You are cutting in and out a bit for me at my end, but I think I got the gist of what you said. I think as we're not talking LTNs tonight, we're just talking Lane and the Northall cycle scheme. I don't think that's necessary.
I'll try and move to another area where my reception will be better. Sorry about that.
That's all right. As I said, we have no urgent matters. We've got no matters to be considered in private, which takes us to the minutes of the meeting on the 4th of February, where we discussed the budget. Did anyone have any comments on the accuracy of the minutes of the last meeting? Don't all speak at once. No, can we take those then as agreed?
Happy to agree those, yeah.
Great, thank you. Members will have seen an update from Ross Brown answering a couple of the outstanding questions circulated by email. Sam, I think we'd said we would put those in the work programme report, but I don't think they're in there.
Apologies, Chair, I missed that out, but I'm happy to upload it as a meeting document to CMIS afterwards, so that it's available for everybody, including the public.
Thank you very much. Which takes us on to our first substantive item, the call-in of the LSP cycle schemes report. For those watching on YouTube who haven't had the pleasure of a OSC call-in before, we have a set procedure. It's been called in by at least 5 members from 2 different political groups. So we have representatives from those 2 groups to present the call-in first. So they will present their reasons for call-in. The administration will then defend the decision made at Cabinet. And we have Councillors Bell and Anand, who are kind of variously responsible for the portfolio together to defend the decision. We have questions from the committee to any of those, and Councillors Bell and Anand have a number of officers with us this evening to help us with any information we might require. Then the callers in, that's this evening, Councillors Malcolm and Young will sum up their reasons, and then Councillors Bell and Anand will respond and give their final summing up. They will then leave the room, Councillors Bell and Anand, virtually leave the room. We can kick them out of the meeting room. And then we will discuss and debate it as a committee amongst ourselves as to what we want to do. Gary and Tony, which of you was going to go first?
I'll let Gary go first.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Yeah, we've not discussed that, so thank you. I'll, as a preface, it isn't a surprise, but I'd just like to reiterate that most people in Southfield who the Fisher's Lane issue affects do not like this scheme. So we've done 2 surveys ourselves, one in October, I think it was, and one more recently, to get an idea of the before and after in both of those different cases. About 70 to 75% of people are against it. Only 10 or 12% of people are in favour of the scheme, with the remainder open to alternatives if the council wanted to. Some of those alternatives may have been the ones that were introduced for the LTNs, where you allow certain blue badge holders to do that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The problems that people have seen, 85% of the people who commented actually had a longer journey and really had to go out of their way to do the normal things that a normal person would do. These are not people who are using the cars for short journeys, who could have walked or cycled. These are people whose jobs involve carrying items from A to B, different parts of Chiswick, and obviously Southfield is one part of Chiswick, as Hounslow is the other. And so that does cause a problem. We've seen many people suffer because of Hounslow and Hammersmith and Fulham implementing their LTNs, which then cause a conflict for ourselves and our residents. And I think this council needs to accept that I don't believe this scheme is working, and I don't believe it should operate as it currently is. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, as a sort of a background, I think many people who know the Fisher's Lane element will know that the Turnham Green Terrace issue was one where, when that first started, the situation was 50 times worse, because there was 2 main ways of getting from A to B, and both of those were turned off. But even though one of those is open now, there are still great problems that we're seeing in many south parts of the ward, and knock-on effects with long journeys. There are other LTNs that are due to operate in Bath Road. So again, Hammersmith and Fulham are coming into the equation here. We have not had a guarantee that Turnham Green Terrace will remain open. If it closed at any point in the future, that would be a problem. I've raised this with officers, and it shouldn't be a miracle for officers to get a guarantee from Hounslow Council, but again, we haven't seen that. Coming on to the consultation, or a lack of in this case, we believe such a big scheme like this should only go ahead if there is a consultation. The other LTNs have had a form of consultation, even though it was many months into the scheme, into operation. So far, the only 2 consultations that have really taken place have been held by ward councillors, and I prefer an official consultation. The handful of emails to the traffic notices, I don't believe is a consultation, and that's not something I would be looking for. And what I want to know is, where are the firm plans about the consultation? So at this stage, I've had meetings with officers, and we've had the cabinet, where I've referred to the details of a consultation. Why is there no details in the cabinet paper or ahead of this to say who the council will consult, the methodology they will use? The timing, I understand, depends on COVID, and I accept that, but not the who and the methodology of that. Because what we want to see is, when will the council consult, who will they consult, and make sure that is a fair methodology. So for anything to proceed, it needs to have that, and it doesn't, so it can't proceed at this particular stage. The other element of a consultation is, what happens if 60% of people are in favour or 60% of people are against it? Very clearly, the council should go ahead with the decision that, it's there to operate, to represent residents. If most residents don't want the scheme, we should not operate it. It's very simple, but we've not had a statement from the leader or the portfolio holder on this, and I think it would be useful to have that clarity, that if there is a consultation and it goes ahead and people are against it, the council will say, okay, we'll drop the scheme then. Then we come on to the exemptions. I mean, officers have said this is different than an LTN. It is different in one sense, but it operates almost in the same way. I think what we need to do is choose the residents who could be exempt, and they're the sort of people I'm looking at are blue badge holders or carers of those individuals, or those who live particularly in the south of the ward. And you could do that, but the council appears not to want to do that, and I think that's unwise, because this situation is far worse therefore than the LTN situation, because we're now being surrounded in Hammersmith and Fulham and Hounslow. We don't have the exemptions that the other LTNs have, and the other LTNs are causing mayhem even with those exemptions. So the scheme is just not working. And lastly, there was other alternatives that were touted by residents or by other individuals who raised them. People talking about whether you should have this scheme, but only for part of the day, maybe in the peak, but not the peak. And again, officers do not appear to have looked at these options when they've come up with their scheme. It's almost like they want to rubber stamp the scheme they originally proposed, and that isn't what we should be allowing officers or the administration to do. We should be challenging them to say, actually, we want a scheme that works for people, and this scheme clearly doesn't work, and we need to get rid of it, in my view. But I would like the clarity from the officers and the committee to say this scheme isn't working, and let's make sure that there is a proper consultation with it. So I'll end my comments there. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you, Councillor Malcolm. Councillor Young, welcome back to OSC.
Thank you, Chair. I won't rehearse the arguments all against LTNs and road closures. You had enough of that. Suffice for me to say that even as a Central Ealing councillor, I have a postbag of complaints from this part of the borough, with people complaining to me that the congestion and the pollution is excessive. I've had complaints from doctors' surgeries saying their patients couldn't get to them, from dentists who say their suppliers couldn't get to them, and from residents saying they couldn't get anywhere, one included who couldn't collect a birthday cake that they wanted to have for their children's birthday because they couldn't put it on a bike because it wouldn't fit and it was too far to carry it. I just want to ask one simple question. This went in for the reason given that Turnham Green Terrace had been closed by Hounslow, and to leave it open would just leave a rat run. Now that Hounslow have reopened Turnham Green Terrace and the reason for its closure has gone, why isn't it being reopened? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Bell, did you want to respond first, or Councillor Land?
Yeah, no, happy to respond first. So thank you, Chair. And let me start with Councillor Young's question about Turnham Green Crescent and why, given we cited that as one reason why we closed Fisher's Lane when Hounslow reopened Turnham Green Crescent, why didn't we then open Fisher's Lane? The answer is that this was about looking to improve the experience for both cyclists and pedestrians. So the Fisher's Lane section is just one part of a north-south cycling route, and if we want to increase the numbers of cyclists and make it safer for pedestrians, we do have to make some tough decisions sometimes to give over more road space to cyclists. This is the direct north-south route of this cycleway that comes through Fisher's Lane. Fisher's Lane is very narrow, and therefore I think the only option that's available, and this answers some of Councillor Malcolm's questions about whether there are alternatives to the closure, talk of only doing it in peak hours, doing it one way, in Turnham Green Terrace, one way in Fisher's Lane. The answer is that doesn't provide the increased safety and road space for cyclists at this particular part of this important north-south cycle route. So I note Councillor Young's comments about complaints, and I'm always happy to listen to people's concerns about how these proposals are impacting. It's an ongoing process for us to listen, and sometimes a consultation can be better when it's actually in real time, and you can see what the actual impacts are. Going on to Councillor Malcolm, he wanted 100% guarantee from Hounslow that they would continue to keep open Turnham Green Terrace. I don't believe that we can get that 100% guarantee from our neighbours in Hounslow. Obviously, we are not expecting them to reclose it, but it's a matter for Hounslow. In terms of the consultation, we, as I've said, regard the actual experimental traffic order, which can run for 18 months, is a continuous consultation, and we welcomed the feedback that ward councillors gave us. Councillor Malcolm's talked about the 2 surveys that they've done. We welcome that feedback, and we've responded to that feedback point by point, and the committee will have seen that. In order to just understand how we might do a consultation, we would be wanting to do it on updated traffic figures and volumes and congestion. And again, we've not been able to do that in a proper way because of the COVID lockdowns that we've had. So there is more work to be done in terms of collecting data, but we will do a survey, a consultation, and it's likely to be by letter drop and an online survey. In terms of the criteria for decision making, the immediate goals of this COVID emergency funding was to provide opportunities for active travel on foot or by bicycle, and underlying that is the wider health and environmental objectives set out both in local and national policy. But the key outcomes that we'll consider will include modal shift, an increase in walking and cycling. And at the moment, the data tells us there's a 2 to 3 times increase in cycling. Road safety is a key issue as well, reduction in collisions involving cyclists and pedestrians, and also cycle network benefits, connectivity and level of service benefits, which I've already kind of alluded to. In terms of the question about blue badge holders, I think I did say to Councillor Malcolm when we discussed this at Cabinet that I would take this away and have a look at it. But the problem we've got with Fisher's Lane is that there's no defined low traffic neighbourhood area associated with this closure, and so for that reason it's problematic to actually decide who would get an exemption and who wouldn't have an exemption. The other problem is if you kind of do a wide definition and said all of the blue badge holders in the borough, for example, could go through and have an exemption, the numbers are such, I think it's about 12,000. You would at that point, I think, get rid of all of the positive cycling benefits that have accrued because of the lack of traffic. The traffic would increase if you give too many exemptions, and so it's with some reluctance that, having looked at it, Councillor Malcolm, I don't think that we're in a position to do that. And finally, you talked about whether or not if there's a straight majority against it. I think would we withdraw it, and I think I've already given those particular outcomes that we will, and criteria for decision making that we will be using: modal shift, road safety, and cycle network benefits, but also we will take into consideration feedback from residents as well. That's part of the decision-making criteria, but this is not a kind of referendum. There are wider issues that we need to take into consideration when we pull all this together. But I think, Chair, that covers anything. I don't know if Councillor.
Great, thank you. Jasbir, did you have anything to add before we move to questions?
Chair, just quickly, I think Councillor Bell's covered most of it. I would say that the closure has been really safe for most cyclists, and some runners really now use the carriageway, making the footway much more pleasant and safer for pedestrians. I think the benefit will really increase as more enforcement reduces the private car travel levels further, and also creates the possibility of widening the footway, which would not been possible before. I think it's about making sure that, you know, if you are a cyclist, you haven't got a frightening experience while cycling down Fisher's Lane, where these measures are put into place. It makes it much more safer people to walk and also cycle. And I think it really does help, because the narrow width means that even a low level of private car traffic can be frightening for people who are walking and cycling. I think we feel as though this has been a successful cycling project, and I think we should let this come to the end of the consultation.
Great, thank you. John, I see your hand. Just before I move to questions, obviously the report does an assessment of both the Fisher's Lane scheme and the Church Road scheme in Northolt Mandeville. Councillors Malcolm and Young, you didn't mention the Northolt scheme. Did you have anything to add on the Northolt scheme before we move to questions, just so we can make sure we stick to the scope of what you're actually
No, the
want to
purpose of
happen
the
here?
call-in was to focus on the Fisher's Lane closure.
That's correct, Councillor Blacker. Yeah, I was only referring to the Fisher's Lane scheme.
Okay, so that should hopefully guide members' questions so that we don't get sidetracked into something that has not been kind of necessarily called in, although it is in the report. And obviously, if we were to refer it back, that scheme would also be impacted. Councillor, so we move on to questions, and councillors, I remind you that it should be questions only at this point. There will be plenty of time to discuss and debate after Julian and Jasbir have left the call. So John, did you want to kick off with questions?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In the equalities assessment, page 58 of 100, it says the exemption for blue badge holders to register one vehicle within the LTN they live will reduce the number of people impacted, etc. So it seems like that this is a cut and paste equalities impact assessment. So is that just, can I ask, you know, is that, I presume that is just a mistake, and has there been a proper equalities impact of this specific scheme? Because I note what was said by Councillor Malcolm and in response by Councillor Bell about you know, that there isn't any blue badge exemption for it. And then second question, which is slightly related, if it's not possible to define the area that you would have a blue badge exemption in, how would it be possible to define the area that you're looking at modal shift from? Because I mean, modal shift was given as one of the key factors for making the decision, but it seems like that also requires a specific area of residents to have a meaningful statistic for whether there has been modal shift or not. So how is that defined?
Great, thanks, John. Julian, on the EAA, and looking at it, it does mention exemptions for blue badge and council authorised vehicles, and then that, as John says, the area covered.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to probably turn most of those questions over to the officers, because I don't have the answer in terms of the equality analysis assessment. In terms of the area that we would we are kind of looking at, obviously mode shift is measured in terms of usage of the kind of strip of road at Fisher's Lane under the railway line, but clearly when we do have our survey at the end, we will have to have some limits in terms of geographic location. So again, I'd ask officers to give us some more detail on how they're going to do that.
Sorry, can I come back on that last bit? Oh, sorry, unless we're hearing.
Yeah, I was just going to invite.
Okay,
Tony.
fine. Officer first.
We've got various officers. We've got Tony, John, Mark, and I think one other with us. I don't know who wanted to pick that up.
Hello, Councillor. It's Mark Holloway. I can take that one up if you like. Certainly about the EAA. I think we generally it probably is a mistake. We produced a generic document which should have been edited for each specific case, but I can assure you that the EAA was carried out.
Okay.
There we go. A year and I can't unmute. John, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, on that response, I mean, I think it would be very helpful if we got a copy of an actual EEA for this scheme, because sort of being assured that it did happen, even though all we see is a generic one, isn't desperately reassuring. But the other point on Councillor Bell's response initially, if we're saying that the way you determine modal shift is on that strip of tarmac and you're banning cars from it, then that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? I don't understand how you can have modal shift unless it's from an area of residence.
Yeah, and I'm saying that that's part of the measurement of it, John. I'm not saying it's the only measurement of it. So I accepted your point that clearly there has to be an area where we're going to do this survey, and we're going to ask those residents in that area, you know, have you cycled more? Are you walking more? Or whatever the question will be. So yeah, I'm looking for one of the officers to come in and just add something to that in terms of how we might actually define that area.
It's Mark Holloway again. We haven't looked at this yet, but it's a valid point. As you have previously stated, Councillor Bell, this is part of a longer distance route. So there may be a case for looking at increases in cycling at other locations along the same route to see whether they reflect a similar rise to that which we're seeing in Fisher's Lane.
Thanks, Mark. Councillor Driscoll, I think, was next on my list. And then I've got, you're in different order on my screen than on my participants. I'll take Sarah, Linda, and then Miriam, because I think that's the order in which hands went up. Paul.
Thanks, Chair. I think to follow on a little bit from where Mark was answering the point about the nature of the route, I'd like a bit of reflection on the impact of, there was a national policy gear change, which was subtitled A Bold Vision for Cycling and Walking, produced by the Department of Transport last year. So I'd like clarification on how that really fundamental rewriting of all the national expectations of what is a cycling route. It's no longer, you know, what does it now mean? And what are the expectations for us as a borough to provide as a cycling route? Because I think that document has just completely rewritten the national expectations. So how does this fit in with that change in rules set by the Department of Transport? And also, how does it fit in with, I mean, it was quoted in the report at the beginning, quote from Grant Shapps about expecting local authorities to make radical changes. So how are all these things tying together? And I think, I mean, I was also going to make the point about, although we're looking at a very small section, it's part of a longer purpose for these routes. So how much of that longer purpose and directional east-west, north-south is being part of the consideration in the location and the assessment, and part of that was started to be answered as well. So I'd like to understand how that is feeding into the network of cycle routes in the broader West London Ealing area. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Big, bold, strategic question, Paul. I like it. Councillor Bell.
Yeah, so it's absolutely right that the government has changed substantially its expectations of councils in terms of their provision for safe cycling and walking infrastructure. And gear change is the document nationally that sets out what those expectations are. And we were cognizant that we will be judged on these new higher standards and the expectations of them as well, and therefore, yeah, we plead guilty to having some bold schemes because we were responding to that new kind of framework and national policy that Councillor Driscoll's outlined. I would just say, on a kind of very personal level, talking to people about why they don't cycle, and anybody who has those conversations will know that the vast majority of people who maybe want to cycle but don't cycle is because they don't feel safe. And Fisher's Lane is a very, very good example of somewhere that's very, very narrow and not safe. You can't have it one way and have cyclists and vehicles going through, because the passing widths are so are very narrow and dangerous, frankly. So unless we were going to do something radical on this, we weren't going to get those changes. Now, in terms of the north-south points that Councillor Driscoll talks about, it does start up in North Acton at the A40, and it goes all the way down to Fisher's Lane, and then south beyond Fisher's Lane to the A4 and the cycle way that kind of comes out of town up the Chiswick High Road. So again, we've been mindful of that kind of cross north-south borough cycle route, and yes, it would be interesting to see what the uptake on other parts of the route is in terms of more cycling, so that we can get a better understanding of what those wider benefits that Councillor Driscoll was rightly highlighting, and which lay behind our decision. We've closed Fisher's Lane because it actually this is a cycleway that we've been talking about doing for some time, and there are long-term plans to make that cycleway infrastructure more permanent, and we would require further funding for that. But certainly, that's our ambition for this, and being able to close Fisher's Lane and have it as part of this cycleway is very convenient, because if you don't do it at Fisher's Lane, you would kind of have to divert to the east or west to go under the railway, and for cyclists a detour like that is much more difficult than for a vehicle driver. So it works on a number of ways, but we're responding to those new national expectations. I don't know if officers want to add anything to
that. The only thing I'd add is to say that the Acton to Chiswick route and the development of that route is a project initiated and supported by TfL, who have done the background work to understand where desire lines and demand for improved cycle facilities are believed to be best delivered in this part of London. So we are. I suspect the DfT are slightly behind TfL in terms of their ambitious plans for cycling, and I think TfL had identified this as a route for some time ago, and it is only really within the last 2 years that we've been able to progress it.
Great, thanks. Councillor Rooney.
Thank you, Chair. So page 21 of the report describes how the scheme in the Vale in Acton has already been completed. I just wanted to ask what significant changes have been noted so far with that scheme. For example, have pollution levels been reduced, and how long is it going to how long, should we expect it to take to see noticeable changes from these schemes? Thank you.
I can give you some general answers to that, Councillor Rooney. So we normally expect these kind of schemes to take quite a while to bed in and to actually make permanent changes, and hence experimental traffic orders can last for 18 months. But it is, and our transport officers can confirm this, quite normal for these kind of schemes to take quite a while before you start to see some of the benefits. One of the benefits of that part of the scheme is a new crossing that that has a cycling lane on it at the side of the pedestrian crossing, and I certainly have seen anecdotal evidence from cyclists saying how much better it is to, as it crosses over the Uxbridge Road, it's much safer and easier to go over that crossing. But I would suspect that because as I said earlier, we've got issues around the lockdowns not allowing us to do some of the surveys that we wanted, that would give us the data that is kind of workable with and helpful, and not skewed by the fact that we're in a lockdown. We've kind of said we need to wait and have some more of those traffic surveys done. I suspect we're not in a position to tell you improvements in terms of air quality, but I'll hand over to the officers to add anything to what I've said.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Thanks. Jazzbeard, you wanted to add something?
Chair, just to say that gaining a good understanding of the immediate and long-term effects of this behaviour change is an ongoing process, and schemes are being monitored to assess the localised impacts on traffic flows and congestion and pollution. And I think it's just a matter of time for us to really be able to measure these impacts and then come back to report back on the findings of how the air pollution and congestion has reduced over time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Councillor Burke was next on my list.
So one of the challenges seems to be around the evaluation. So my question really is, I totally understand that we need different criteria, but do we have an algorithm which actually says weighting around them, even in broad terms? So again, totally get it, can't be a referendum. And second follow-up question to that is, if we do, or if we've got some sort of model that we use, how does our model compare to those used in other boroughs? And what have we learned from where those have worked well or otherwise?
Thanks, Linda. Julian.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing us back to a discussion that we've had at OSC with regard to certainly LTNs, and you could argue that the same principles that we've discussed in that regard apply to a scheme such as the Fisher's Lane one as well. So,
sorry, Julian, except for the fact that I would assume that there would be a lot more experience and history with the bike scheme than cycling schemes than LTNs. So I guess that's really where I'm coming from.
No, fair enough, and I'll let officers come in on that in a minute. All I would say is that certainly in terms of the work that we're doing to give some kind of weightings to the different criteria that we'll look at, that's kind of ongoing work that we will bring back to OSC for the LTNs, and if there's a way that we can apply that to these schemes, or if, as you're asking, there's more historic models that we may already have, I'll ask officers to fill in on that. But good question, Linda. Thank you.
Mark, did you want to?
I'm not involved in the LTNs, so I don't know. I don't have much detail on the methodology that they're going to use to assess those. But as Councillor Bell said, yes, if they develop a methodology that is satisfactory and meets people's expectations of the kind of things we should be taking into account, then there's no reason why it couldn't probably be applied to cycle schemes as well.
Sorry, Josh, can I just pop back? I'm really not asking about LTNs. I mean, my knowledge is limited, but just I would have thought that people have evaluated cycling schemes, and the question really is, what have we taken from other boroughs that have done this, and how, or have we, or should we?
We haven't at present. I guess all boroughs are in the same situation as regards implementing schemes under the COVID conditions. There is, the general way in which we would find out what other boroughs are doing is through papers in official, in sort of publicly available publications. That's generally how we would find out about what other boroughs were doing and their assessment methods. It's possible that because this is a London, it's a countrywide thing, obviously, but certainly TfL may in time look at ways in which they can assess these schemes, but I'm not aware of anything at the moment.
Councillor Anand, you have your hand up. Do you want to come in on that?
Sorry, Chair, legacy hand.
Ah, okay. Great, thanks. So that leaves us with Councillor Rice.
Oh, thank you, Chair. One thing I'm interested in is how we go about consulting with special groups within our community, such as what's actually mentioned in the paperwork that we've got, talking about blue badge holders or carers, for example. I mean, I do understand it's hugely difficult to consult and to get questions out there to the general population anyway. Certainly when we've made changes to different things to do with roads in the past, we maybe put an advert in the Ealing Gazette, which of course no one can get hold of. Sometimes just puts a notice up on a lamppost or something. But I mean, I know that even in the building where I live, there are some people who don't venture out into particular streets around the building, and so wouldn't even see a sign. So I'm just wondering how it is to go about ensuring that we do get to speak to particular groups who may have particular special needs. Thank you.
Chair, so to answer Councillor Rice's question, yeah, I've talked about how we would be wanting to do a wider kind of all population group in a certain geographical area around Fisher's Lane, but that would include residents associations, user groups, and it would include those like blue badge holders or those with disabilities. So yeah, we would want to make sure that we are as inclusive as we possibly can in terms of that consultation that we're going to do. And again, you know, I'll make the point, we're mindful that not everybody is kind of digitally connected, and so you know you always need to give people the kind of paper option, and for people to be able to feed in that way if they don't have access to the internet, which, you know, considerable numbers of people still have difficulty in having digital access. I don't know if officers want to add anything, Chair.
It doesn't sound
nothing.
like it.
Yeah, I was going to say nothing really from me. I mean, we have an established methodology for consulting on schemes. I think there is scope for some consideration of how we do reach sort of possibly the harder to reach sections of society, but generally response rates tend to be pretty low for most of our consultations, even when we post out directly to houses. So it's more a question of increasing the response rate, I think, rather than necessarily increasing the reach of the consultations.
Thanks. And I think given the responses to the surveys that the ward councils have run, I think we can't say that people aren't aware of it. I haven't got any further hands up. The only question I had, obviously we've got in Appendix B some very helpful data on bus journey times through Fisher's Lane itself. This also suggests that traffic volumes have dropped by 80%, which is huge. Some almost 12,000 vehicle movements. Clearly, you know, the question is, are those going somewhere and are they having an impact elsewhere? Do we have any feedback from TfL on bus journey times for the E3, for instance, to see what the impact of that displacement is? So obviously, you know, this is great on Fisher's Lane, but we need to consider the impact elsewhere. So do we know if the E3 is experiencing huge delays getting up and down Turnham Green Terrace as a result, for instance?
I don't know the answer to that, Josh, but officers may.
We don't have that information at present, but it's certainly something we can consider in the next round of surveys.
Right, thank you. Are there any then final questions before we move to ask Gary and yes, we do. Councillor Driscoll.
Yeah, thank you. It's just to get a clarification from officers on page 45 of 100, which is the Appendix B. So the Fisher's Lane traffic data comparisons. So looking at 2019 and 2020. So, I mean, it talks about total vehicles. It's my understanding total vehicles includes everything traveling with wheels, essentially. But it's saying that of this, a proportion was cyclists. Now, it looks like the number of cyclists has increased dramatically. I mean, am I reading this right? From 2019 to 2020? I don't know. Is there a comparable? I mean, not in this paper here and now, but just from officers' knowledge about cycling improving in the general area or nationally. Is this just reflective of that national trend, or is it greater than that trend as well? So is Fisher's Lane outpacing a national trend? So I'm just trying to think, where are we pitching ourselves in this change? Are we following on from what's changing elsewhere, or are we stepping ahead? So if officers have got some input in there, that would be helpful.
I don't have any specific information at present. Obviously, there has been an increase in active travel of all kinds during lockdown, primarily because perhaps people don't want to get on public transport. How Fisher's Lane compares nationally, I don't have that information at present, but it's certainly, again, something that would be, I think, of interest to us as officers, as well as obviously to the general public. So we'll look into trying to quantify that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say from my reading, we've got 16,500 vehicle movements in 2019, of which 637. But then you look at just over 5,000 vehicle movements, but a massive increase. So as a proportion, it's even more ahead of where I would expect it to be. I'm just trying to tease out, where are we pitching ourselves and where are we going with this? I appreciate I'm asking you off the cuff about some specific details, but it's interesting to sort of draw that out.
Yeah, and certainly the route itself, the whole Acton to Chiswick route, as I said earlier, has been identified by TfL as having a potential for significant increase in cycling trips. That's why the route has been funded by them, because they've identified it as a potential growth area. So again, I can't be specific, but yes, I would expect that the number of figures we're seeing now in Fisher's Lane is a reflection of that background research that has been done to identify, likely areas for where improved cycle facilities would attract more cyclists.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, if I can just come in,
Sure.
my understanding was that nationally it was about a 15% increase in cycling, whereas we're talking 2 or 3 times the increase in cyclists here. So I think we're outperforming the national picture if I've got my percentages correct.
Great, thank you. If there are no other questions, then Councillor and Jasbir, I'm assuming that is still a legacy hand.
Yes, it is, Chair. I'm really struggling to pull it down. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I will just try and bear it in mind. So, Councillor Malcolm, did you want to sum up then your reasons for calling and what you want us to do, followed by Councillor Young?
Thank you, Councillor Black. Yeah, there's a couple of interesting issues that people have raised. I'll jump from them a little bit, but you asked the issue about displacement. The commentary from what people have told me, which is obviously anecdotal, but some of it came back from over 600 survey returns and over 900 the first time, is that there is a displacement and people are going via Turning Green Terrace or Acton Lane. So they're going eastwards or westwards respectively, to sort of avoid that area now that they're not allowed to go under there. And that's causing great congestion at those 2 locations. In terms of the data, you're actually looking at apples versus oranges, because one is a term time and one is a non-term time. At the cabinet meeting itself 3 or 4 weeks ago, that was referred to, I think myself and the others who spoke in that issue. And I think one of the things is you need to look at like for like data, and currently that isn't what we have there at all. So there is a danger you're drawing conclusions from data that clearly is never going to be like for like. I think Councillor Ball's comments very early on in the debate go some way to actually showing that you do need a geographical location, even though the officers said that isn't what they were planning on doing. But clearly there is no reason why, if you're consulting people in the whole of Southfield or a section of it, that is a geographical location. And you need something like that for blue badge holder exemptions. And I think Councillor Bell referred to there are 12,000 blue badge holders in the borough. Now, I'm not saying someone in Perivale probably goes to Fisher's Lane, and therefore I'm not saying you should necessarily give exemptions to every blue badge holder in the whole borough. But clearly there is a section in Acton and a section in the Chiswick part of Ealing who are suffering under these current situations, and they're the ones we should be looking at. And it's a shame that the report hasn't done the research that it should have done. A couple of months ago when Cabinet was being put together, we can also see the stuff about the consultation. Councillor Bell talks about not wanting this to be a referendum. Well, ultimately, when you're trying to get people to be cyclists who aren't currently cyclists, you need to win people over. And winning people over is the process. You need to get some people who use cars to not use cars a proportion of their time. And introducing a scheme in this way is counterintuitive. It's not going to, you're just going to get anger and not winning people over. And I think the only way to do this is to actually win people over by persuading them in a way, and doing this sort of radical thing I don't think is helping the process at all. So I mean that's my sort of comments. I think it should go back to Cabinet to look at some of these details which have been fleshed out. We still haven't got that EAA, and I don't believe you can proceed with the environmental assessments not apparently shared with the members tonight or even Cabinet originally. It's regrettable.
Thanks. And Councillor Young.
Yes, looking at the figures of the traffic data comparison, I see members getting very excited about an increase of 100 or 200 per day of cyclists using the route. But I'm getting very excited about the 3,000 or 4,000 vehicles who are not using the route. You're causing life-changing congestion and disruption to the people in that area by closing this road to car traffic. It's not worth it. If you remember that the cyclists are mainly male, mainly young and fit, you're discriminating against the elderly, the female population, people who deserve our thoughts and our care, not people who are young and able. We ought to be giving more to the people who need it, not the people who want it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Councillor Bell then to sum up for the administration.
Yeah, so on Councillor Malcolm's point about displacement, and I think also Councillor Young has alluded to some of the congestion issues as well. You know, in terms of making these changes, the principal congestion when we implemented this scheme was on Acton Lane. And it's worthwhile noting, after traffic changes such as the one on Fisher's Lane, congestion can initially be bad and can take a few months to settle down. So, yeah, this point that I've made before, that actually these things take a long time to bed in, and schemes shouldn't be reviewed until those initial effects have actually worn off and traffic's fully adapted. Congestion on Acton Lane, as you, Chair, will probably know, as a South Acton councillor, has been bad for a long time, and hence the number of drivers using Fisher's Lane to avoid it. So even if this congestion had not got no worse, drivers' experience would compare unfavourably with their previous route via Fisher's Lane. Now, you know, sometimes there are roadworks, and that was an issue that applied to Acton Lane at the beginning, and you know, we need to try and factor those out. In terms of the data point, I think we did have this discussion, Councillor Malcolm, about the limitations of data, and what you compare things with, and we accepted the limitations of that data, but on the other hand, it did show us something, even though it wasn't perfect, and there was a clear indication that there was more cycling taking place as a result, and that is the kind of a significant outcome that we are looking for. In terms of Councillor Young's, and I'll end on this point, Chair, caricature of cyclists as middle-aged men in lycra, or even not even middle-aged men. He seems to think they're all young men. I just don't think that's correct. It's
the figures are 3 to 1 if you were interested.
So cycling is something for all age groups and all people, and that's what we are looking to provide this new cycle way and route through Fisher's Lane for. It's about the people who are not cycling but who would want to, and perhaps, you know, in terms of those who are cycling, maybe yes, there are more fit males, but in terms of who we're building this for and doing this for, it's for those older women or you know, younger children who might want to safely cycle but don't feel able to because they're not protected, and you know, this allows us to do that. And I guess, you know, we'll need to do more traffic studies to as the lockdown lifts, in order to get more data that will enable us to make a final decision later in this process. But I'll finish at that point, Chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Councillor Rand, was there anything to add?
No, Chair, thank you.
Great. So Julie and Jasper, thank you. We will now ask you both to log off so that the committee can have its deliberations without the administration present. Officers, feel free to leave as well, because we won't be asking any further questions of you as well. Although Liz, that doesn't apply to you, since we will be coming to you, Liz, for the HR report. I've seen Councillor Ball's hand up already. If others could indicate as well. I'm just going to double check on my list. I think they have both dropped off. So Councillor Ball, did you want to open up?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I think before talking about this, it's worth just making the point that there have been in the previous tranche some generally agreed to be successful cycling schemes. So Councillor Bell had a picture of the the type of things we have along the Uxbridge Road, including along Ealing Common in my ward. And those are successful schemes that encourage cycling, but are generally supported by the community. But this particular scheme on Fisher's Lane is problematic. Yeah, I mean, I think I was very concerned. My question earlier on about people with disabilities, that we're being asked to take on trust that there has been a proper EEA done for disability issues, but what we see before us was admitted to be just a generic one. So I really struggle to see how we can have confidence that the needs of disabled residents have been looked at specifically in relation to this scheme. Also, I think you asked a very good question, Chair, about the E3 bus. So are we improving bus times through Fisher's Lane, but at the same time increasing the parallel route? And I think, yeah, also I think Councillor Burke's question about assessments, the answer didn't fill me with great confidence that previous cycle schemes have been assessed particularly well in the borough, or that the officers have a good handle of sorry, my kids trying to intervene.
I was about to ask people to mute, but it is you, isn't it?
It is me, I'm afraid. Yeah, sorry.
Not a lot we can do. Carry on.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think that's right. I don't have a great deal of confidence from that the assessments are being done properly, and that the understandings from other boroughs are being thoroughly looked at. And I think on the figures, which largely does come down to, and I mean, perhaps they're not very representative, but even on the basis of the figures that we have, at best, you're getting hundreds of additional cyclists going down there, a lot of which may well be simply diverted from from Turnham Green Terrace, so they're just going a slightly different route. But you are at the same time inconveniencing many thousands of residents who drive, and also thousands of pedestrians and residents who have additional air quality problems, additional pollution in their streets due to the congestion. So you do have to kind of weigh this, and I think it does seem to me that the Cabinet hasn't weighed up all these figures and should be asked to reconsider this report. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Councillor Driscoll, I've got you, and then I've got Linda, and then Dan.
Yeah, because I think the whole nature of what is expected from councils, local authorities has changed. The national publication of the document Gear Change really threw out everything that we were expecting cycle provision to be. Previously, a painted road was perfectly acceptable. A strip of blue paint, well, that was as much security as you needed. And to go back to the concluding comments of Councillor Young, are we doing something just for a very gender biased part of society? Well, if you look elsewhere, I think the majority of cyclists in Denmark are women. It's about 50-50 in Germany, and it's a majority in Holland. And that didn't happen overnight. And crucial to that is feeling safe on a road. And that Fisher's Lane pinch point is very, if you're a cyclist, and I speak as a very recent cyclist, you know, I go with some trepidation along some main roads, and when I see, oh, now it's bollarded and now I've got a segregated section, it's a great relief. And I'm one of the older males. So if we expect to change and to make change, then we have to provide the infrastructure, and that's what's expected now. A painted strip on a road just will not cut it and will not be acceptable, and neither is the planning cycling routes that are indirect, circuitous, and not easily accessible. So we've got Chiswick High Road, which has got a great cycling route. Then as soon as you turn off it, you meet some pinch points which are dangerous, and that's Fisher's Lane. So the whole remit of what we expected from national government has been completely rewritten last year, and I think how we expect that and how we explain what our duty by national guidance is really important. It's not what it was. I think looking at the figures, there may be some, it's not quite a seasonal comparison, fair enough, but it's so dramatic, the change, that you know, it's kind of, are we in the right direction? I think the points about, are we consulting a geographical area? Well, that's important, but if we're getting people to cycle longer distances, then we need to make sure we've got connectivity, and we can't just break connectivity intermittently and expect cyclists to go through quite dangerous areas and expect still to continue on a longer journey. So I think we have to assess Fisher's Lane as part of that north-south route and how it's probably benefited for the massive improvement on Chiswick High Road that Hounslow have done. I think if you build it, they will come. That's part of a bit of a mantra. And if we don't provide that infrastructure, then how are we expecting the gender balance to change? How are we expecting it to be open and appealing? I think there's a lot to do with the assessment and how we understand the impact locally. I think that's absolutely valid to understand. But 11% of car journeys in London are 1 kilometre. 11%, that's huge. I think generally at around about half term, you're looking like a dip in traffic of 10%. So if we're looking for that modal shift, there will be a local benefit for that as well. So I think there's lots of things that have changed nationally that we are now catching up with, and that's part of where we need to be reflecting on at the moment. So thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Councillor Burke. And we've been joined on the list by Councillors Dadwell and Rice as well. So Linda and then Dan and then those other two.
So a couple of points. I actually agree very strongly with Paul in terms of, you know, the ambition, etc., etc. And I actually would say that if it's a few hundred, it's by how, John, I do agree with you that it might be small numbers, but if small numbers then multiply exponentially, it can make a real positive difference. Everything starts with small numbers. So the only thing is, I think we're not doing ourselves a massive amount of favours on 2 points. One is the way that was explained in terms of the criteria was much clearer than anything I can find on our websites or I can see anywhere that actually says, this is the whole breadth of criteria that we're looking at. And this is the kind of trends we're looking for. We don't have to say, if it's 20, we will, if it's 19, we won't. And you've all heard me say this before. So we need something much clearer about this is the pattern of behaviour we're looking for. And these are the kind of differences we're expecting. And I have to say, I did just Google evaluation studies, and there are a lot of them. You know, predictably, Netherlands, Denmark, etc., etc. And they do include things like gender, and they do include things like age profile. So I just find it a bit concerning that You know, LTNs are new, cycle lanes aren't. There's plenty of information out there. If we were saying to our residents, communicating, if you look at what's happened in Paris, if you looked at what's happened in Copenhagen, etc., and the different Oslo, some of the, you know, in the last 10 minutes that I've found. So I just wonder if we could push back a little from this committee in terms of officers saying these are not new things. Can we please just be a little bit clearer in terms of the criteria and in terms of the kind of trends that we're looking for to help ourselves demonstrate that these are really useful schemes that can actually make a positive difference to people's lives.
Thanks, Linda. Councillor Crawford.
Thank you, Chair. Struggling to unmute myself there as well. But my colleagues have rather stolen my thunder with their previous contributions. I'll be brief, but I'll preface my comments by saying, you know, I support the bold aspiration to improve cycling in the borough. And I think from the tone of most of the comments this evening, most of my colleagues do as well, although Councillor Young was a little bit strident in his final salvo, as it were, in presenting his side of the call-in. We don't, you know, we're living through a climate emergency. We passed policy to that effect as a council. It's up to local authorities to do what they can to try and mitigate that. And one of the things that this administration has sought to introduce is the modal shift to which people have referred. And that's only going to work if there are better facilities for cycling. That being said, I do think Councillors Ball, Malcolm and Young have reasonable points in regard to something I've spoken about for a long time, which is the way in which the council communicates with its citizens and how we communicate what these changes are, how they will be measured, what all impacts will be, and what the scope is for communities to shape that change should they so wish. Now, it may be that some people aren't really bothered, but clearly some people will be bothered by the changes to their neighbourhood. So we should be setting out, and this goes for LTNs and other schemes as well, we should be setting out what our aspiration is with regard to these schemes, and what, if they are realised, is going to be the impact of that, along the lines of what Councillor Burke and Councillor Driscoll have already said. So I do agree with the suggestion that there should be more coming from the Cabinet, or if it's not the Cabinet, the communications arm of the council, to set out how we're going to implement some of these changes, because Councillor Driscoll is right in that these schemes haven't just appeared from nowhere. They've come at the express invitation and encouragement of a government that says local authorities have to do this in order to realise the funding. And I would say as well something about cycling, which, you know, some of these issues get distilled simply down to people who cycle and people who don't, and people who are motorists and people who aren't, and people who walk everywhere and people who don't. And I don't think life is quite that simple anymore, certainly not in the experience of most of my residents, some of whom will have a car and cycle, some of whom won't have a car and yet don't cycle, and many of whom will use many different means of transport to get themselves around the borough. So we need to be clear about what our aspirations are. I support these schemes and the idea of what we're trying to do, because if we're to achieve the kind of environmental change that we want to make over a period of time, this is going to be a key part of it. And frankly, the cycling infrastructure in this borough has been an embarrassment for far too long. And I'll end there, Chair, because I could go on for quite some time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I thank you as someone who is self-avowed cyclist but learned to drive in the last year. So I think your point there is absolutely right. Councillor Dadwell.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, as a part-time cyclist myself, I can honestly say that one of the reasons I don't commute on my bike more is purely because I don't feel safe and I've had too many close calls. Therefore, I'm in favour of anything that makes life safer for cyclists. Not just that, but getting more people on their bikes is so much better for the environment, and not just as a council, as a species. You know, that's something we need to look at, how we can help with the environment, help with global warming, and surely if this even helps a small bit towards it, it's a win. Finally, with regards to Councillor Young's comments, and my father is probably going to kill me for this, but I would say he's old and he can probably outcycle a lot of people I know. But again, due to safety issues, he no longer feels safe commuting by bike. And schemes like this will help get people of all ages and genders back on their bikes. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Chair. Because it's one thing that I've maybe discussed before at the committee here, but I just would like to see what we can actually do and what's actually wanted from us in order to work with residents, in order to help them with that modal shift. What is it that they actually want help with? What is it they want to do? How can we work together with them? What is it that they actually require from us? I think that's probably more that I'd like to find out from them. And so maybe that's something that really could be brought out in consultation, how we can work together with residents to help them with that modal shift. And I mean, it's just certainly very interesting, the comments that people are making about helping different groups and different people to get out and cycle. It's not something that I probably thought enough about. And after what Councillor Bell said earlier, I can just see there's some kind of, I can just compare it with my own experiences of when I was wanting to go swimming a good few years ago. And I felt quite intimidated by having young men that were quite boisterous around me. And so I just felt unconfident in the swimming pool. So I just used to go to women-only swimming sessions. So it was the only way that I felt able to actually get across the pool safely, because I wasn't the strongest swimmer, but I needed to keep fit. But I think it's pretty much the same with a lot of the cyclists, that people just really do need that little bit more kind of help to become more confident and feel safer to do so. Thank you.
Thanks. And then finally, Councillor Dabrowska.
Thank you, Chair. And apologies for my lateness. I was actually coming back from hospital trying to get through the traffic actually in time for this meeting. I wanted to raise with regards to the holistic approach to improving cycling facilities for residents, for commuters, for visitors, for anybody who's using our roads. Ultimately, for example, what Councillor Bell said about, for example, the EA in terms of assessing, for those who need it the most, who are more vulnerable. I remember when I got my bicycle through the cycle scheme at the council. I was a cyclist as a kid, didn't do anything in my 20s, and I came back with, being an adult, fully fledged, fully weighted adult. And I went back to cycling. So I thought I'll be cycling to the council, usually probably in good weather rather than the rain. And the one thing I realised is the council is looking at these massive schemes to overhaul cycling. Now, no one's going to say cycling is bad. Cycling is good. But what the council is missing is actually sorting out the basics. Once you get the foundations right, then the dialogue can occur to what and how we can improve the facilities, but partially through consultation and partially just through having a dialogue in terms of what's needed. I pass Uxbridge Road on most days. And for example, I've been reporting since last autumn to trim the basal growth of trees on the Uxbridge Road where the cyclists are passing. If the council can't sort out heavy basal growth, which actually pokes you, you're not even as a driver, but actually as a cyclist as well, can't you get the basics right? The road surface, for example, is very poor. So instead of looking for, huge sort of wanted cycle lanes or road restrictions, get the basics right. Because I remember cycling to the council and I felt unsafe cycling actually by the curb, where cyclists usually would be found, because it was too bumpy. The drainage was sticking out, or they were sunken. I had to cycle in the middle of the road. And by cycling in the middle of the road, I had a car behind me, for example, or trying to overtake me. Let's get the basics right and then have a dialogue about improving cycling borough-wide. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else with their hands up, so I think we can probably move to close. I think whatever we decide, I think we probably should as a committee ask for the equalities assessment analysis to be provided to us, and I think it is absolutely right that having a generic one that has bits pasted in from other things isn't acceptable, and that we would expect the final decision on this scheme to have a proper EAA done. I think we also need to suggest that that final decision is made as a result of wider data. And I think Councillor Malcolm admitted some of the suggestions about congestion around Turnham Green Terrace and other places is anecdotal at this point. And as a committee, we can't say one way or the other. One anecdote will say it's congested. It's part of my run route, my regular run round the south of Acton and through Chiswick, and I don't see that congestion at the times I run. So I think we should probably get some firmer data on that congestion before we can say that it is as bad as some of the anecdotes say. And I think Councillor Ball's point about cyclists taking different routes, it may well be true. We don't know that without the wider data. But as others have said, providing a safer route is still a benefit. And TfL has collision data maps available, and we could look at the data in terms of collisions and see where cyclists are being knocked off in the area. I went down Fisher's Lane and was waved through a bus who waited, and it felt a lot safer than Acton Lane or Turnham Green Terrace would have done. I always enjoy the mammals point. I always find those who are kind of more middle-aged, more clad in lycra, are those who are more against segregated lanes and safe cycling infrastructure, because they feel confident. They're already the people who are using roads. They're not the ones who we need to persuade through safer infrastructure and safer routes. So kind of looking at who is cycling now doesn't tell you who could cycle and who might be cycling. And I think that's some of the questions we need to ask as a council is who is cycling, who could be, and who has been encouraged by this. So I haven't heard massive opposition to this report. I haven't heard great clamour for it to go back, except for from perhaps those who are interested in events on May the 6th, I think it is this year, who may be interested more in local politics than good governance on the council. But I'm going to suggest that the committee upholds the decision and does not refer it back to committee, albeit with the provisos that I mentioned around the EAA and the final decision taking into account wider data. If John, you want to suggest that we vote on that, I'm happy to do so.
That's what I was just bring.
Yes, I think
it's. Yeah, you can see me. You can see me hovering on the button. Yeah, I mean, I think what you have said is very constructive in terms of taking these points on board. But I think, given the nature of the issues, in terms of consultation and in terms of particularly the disability issues, I think there is ample cause for it to be sent back to cabinet. So I think we should push it to a vote. But as I say, I'm nonetheless welcome your comments if the vote doesn't go the way I would like it to.
Great, thank you. Sam, could you remind me how we do votes on Zoom these days?
Yeah, I think the feedback has been when we've been using the functionality within Zoom is it's a bit patchy. So I think the best thing to do is we go to a named vote, everyone, not a recorded vote, but a roll call vote. If I call the names out, because I've got my list ready to mark against everyone's names, and we will take it that Chair, you've proposed, the proposal you put forward there is that this to be the decisions to be upheld with those provisos. If members, when I read out your name, you could let me know whether you're for, against, or abstaining on that proposal. I will take your vote and mark it against your name, and then I'll give you the figures at the end and whether this motion has been upheld or fallen. Is that okay with you, Chair?
That sounds fine. So agreeing with my proposal that we uphold the decision is voting for.
That's right. And if you're against it, then you vote against it, and if you're abstaining, then of course I'll mark that you've abstained.
Great. Happy then for you to run that roll call quickly then.
Okay, so Councillor Blacker?
For.
Councillor Burke?
For.
Councillor Conlon is not present. Councillor Costigan?
Hoskin's on mute.
Yeah. 4.
4. Okay. Councillor Crawford.
4, please.
Councillor Driscoll.
4.
Councillor Dadwell.
4.
Councillor Rice.
4.
Councillor Rooney.
4.
Councillor Woodruff.
4.
Councillor Anjum.
4.
Councillor Dubrovska.
Hang on. Against.
Councillor Ball.
Against.
So, yeah, so that motion passed. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I haven't voted.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Shaw. I apologise. I didn't have you down on the attendance. So,
That's all
yes,
right. I'm for you.
you're 4
Thanks.
as well. Sorry, apologies there, Councillor Shaw. So I've got 11 in favour, 2 against. So the motion has passed.
Right, thank you. So the decision is upheld, and we will, and John, that's helpful in terms of supporting those provisos and the suggestions that we get the EAA to the committee, and that we recommend that the wider data be looked at for the final decision on the schemes. Gary and Anthony, thank you very much for coming. You're free to stick with us or watch on YouTube or enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. So we move to item 7, Ealing Council Workforce Equalities, and Liz Childs, who is Director of HR. I'm never very good. I'm sorry, Liz, with specific title. Director of People and Organisational Development. And Organisational Development. There we go. Important to remember. And I think we also have Samantha Whittick with us.
She's our People and Organisational Development business partner who works in the team very closely with me on this agenda.
Great, thank you. So this is something that OSE requested an item on, I think coming up to kind of 2 years ago now. And I think you have very helpfully uploaded a presentation as well to CMIS already, which I've had a flick through. Will you share that on screen for us and take us through it, or?
Yeah, I'm going to have a go at sharing my screen now, but hold on a moment.
Fab. Sam, you may need Sam, I don't know if you need to make Liz a host or enable it for her.
Do let me know if you can see it. Hang on.
Not yet.
Not yet. Hang on, it's just coming, I think. You should be able to see it any moment.
Brilliant. Thank you. If you could just pop it on presentation mode so it's full screen as well.
Yeah, I will do.
Members, it is also on CMIS already, so if you are finding it hard to, if you've got a second device, you can look at it on there as well. Liz, over to you then.
Great. Thank you, councillors, and thank you, Chair. So this is a quick summary for this evening, which you've already had, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'll perhaps whiz through it fairly promptly and then take questions if I may. So the background to this is, within this presentation, is the workforce inequalities update that we did for senior leadership team last July. Followed by, I'll talk a bit about the establishment of the Tackling Officer Inequalities Working Group and the appointment of our inequalities partner, DWC, and some of the emerging themes from that work. So in terms of the update for SLT last July, I think if I focus on some of the feedback that we took to SLT about, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of, it's been talked about before, senior management not being representative of the community we serve, lack of equality of opportunity to develop and progress, an absence of formal forums and networks, transparency of data regarding protected characteristics, including when we do reorganisations and the equality impact assessments, suitable equality and diversity training and development, and a lack of confidence to have open and honest conversations, and lack of action after raising issues with line managers about discriminatory practice. So that's a sort of summary of the feedback we had. In terms of the workforce data and the issues highlighted last summer, and this is a summary of the information we publish on the council website, but it was just to focus on some of the issues that, in terms of the workforce, in January 2020, 38.6% of the workforce were white and 47.4% were Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. I have grouped those together, but we have the breakdown on the website as well. But in terms of the gradings, if you look across at the gradings of where staff are in the organisation, we have good representation in some of the lower graded posts, but as you work further up the organisation, particularly grades sort of 13 to 16 and grades 17 and above, and including the chief officer grades, our representation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff is not as great. Also, as part of this report, the information that was presented, there was some detail behind that, but most of it's on the website. We also presented back, the fact that our female workforce is 57%, male workforce is 43%. But if you look at the Ealing directors team at the very top of the organisation, of which I'm part, there's 18 of us. Although the gender split is equal, there are actually only 2 directors who are not white. And we have worked quite hard on that, and some of you will know, hopefully all of you know, Dipti Patel was appointed last year, and prior to that, David Francis was appointed director of the West London Alliance. And I would also say you're probably aware we're out to recruit at the moment for an executive director of place, a permanent executive director. And our brief has been to headhunters for quite some time that they must bring forward a long list and hopefully then through to a short list of a more representative group of applicants for members to consider. I'll just move on. So this next page is a summary of the work that Samantha and I have been working on with the HR team and colleagues in terms of some of the things we'd already prior to last year started work on. So lots of work on recruitment going on, but still work in progress. Employee casework, which has been discussed also at Council and Trade Union Joint Committees, about transparency and about potential, people being treated unfairly. So that casework system went live last week, and that will enable us to be much more transparent and report on, and including in freedom of information inquiries, of which we often get, about where we are on casework, what are the backgrounds of staff that are going through formal cases. Is it actually the case that we're discriminating, or is it just that we don't record, we're not recording these things as well as we might do, and are we progressing them at a speed we should be? So looking for patterns, sharing the data. So that casework system is now live. HR policies, there's work to be done on that in the coming year. Sickness absence, we're particularly looking at the impact of COVID on sickness absence and staff in the last year. Sickness absence overall has actually gone down and is lower than it normally is, but obviously we've had quite a number, and particularly since January, of COVID related sickness absence. So we're looking at that from a protected characteristic position. Now we're at the end, after the end of March, we can now run that report. Reorganisations, again, looking at the reviewing the compulsory and voluntary redundancy leaver data. So we're quite good at looking at the equality impact assessment as we go into reorganisations, but there's room to improve about the backwards look, who actually ended up leaving the organisation either on a voluntary or compulsory basis. The individual development, and you've probably seen the recent emails about this, so sorry that you keep getting bombarded with emails, but the current appraisal system was piloted, completed, focuses on conversational practice, and Samantha and the team have worked really hard on that, and the training has been rolled out for that. It's gone live in April, and we're still hoping that those few people that haven't attended yet get on that training, because that is key to our equalities agenda, about making sure every member of staff has the opportunity to have a conversation about their development, whether they've been with us a long time, not been with us, but to make sure no one's overlooked, because that's where our shared responsibility is across the organisation. Development opportunities, we're working with the apprenticeship team to look at apprentices coming in, and also about when apprentices who come in new to the organisation, when they finish their apprenticeship, that we look at where we can progress them through to, because many of those are coming from more challenging backgrounds, and that's an important piece of work for us as well. I think I've talked about representation at senior levels, so there is some more to be done on that, because it's about progression plans for staff. So whilst we can, when we're recruiting externally, we can ask our partners in that to look for a diverse range of candidates for us. Ealing actually does have a diverse range of people in the workforce, and we need to do better at developing progression plans for them and understanding what the barriers are to them either applying or being successful in getting those roles. So there's work to do with the directors team in terms of understanding lived experiences of others. There's a piece of work around training going on, particularly around recruitment and selection, that we'll be rolling out this in the coming months. We think we can do better with our recruitment and selection, and that's also part of an HR improvement plan about how we monitor and evaluate how well panels are doing, and making sure that all the things happen, and we look at the transparency of all that and develop the skills around that. It's really important that we do still recruit in spite of budget restrictions. People leave us and we do recruit, and every recruitment in my opinion is an opportunity to improve representation if we're proactive about it. We're looking at levers and doing exit interviews, but to be honest, with COVID, this is one that's sort of gone on the back burner a bit. We're going to have a timed action plan for the rest of these activities, but this is one that will come through in the coming months, but we just haven't had time to focus on that. But it's important to understand, other than the ad hoc information we get, why a more systematic approach to understanding why people leave the organisation. And so number 11 on here is about the engagement of the external organisation, which I'll come on to in a moment. And there is also a big piece of work that we need to do about continuing to publish our data, which we do every year on the website, but not just publish it, to review it every year, to understand it, to break it down into directorates and for individual directors to understand where are the issues within their particular service areas. So I'll just briefly touch on that. So there was a Tackling Inequalities Officer Working Group established, and this was to pull together not just the workforce work strand, but also the impact of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters, and looking at the resident situation as well. And you'll all be aware the commission for the residents is chaired by Lord Simon Woolley. I won't go into the detail of all this, other than to talk about perhaps the work streams are quite diverse. The workforce is very, very important, but there is some wider work streams about equalities needs assessments. There was the consultation on Havelock Road, which was part of our conversations around this, and looking at the Equality Act and prioritising work we do in the council. So the membership of this group is quite diverse. It's chaired by the Chief Executive, but Councillors Bell and Cabadoo Rothwell are part of this. There's representation from Unison, GMB, service directors, as well as the chairs of the Black, Asian and minority ethnic children and adults equality groups, which have been established in the last 6 months. So there's good representation there, and lots of challenging questions are asked, and we meet monthly at the moment. So briefly on the inequalities partner, DWC, and some of the emerging themes. So they were given a brief to really, as specialists in this work area, and they work with other authorities, to actually talk to the workforce without us there, to in terms of general groups and specific groups of staff around protected characteristics, to understand really what is the experience for them, and where people could share really honestly what has been going on for them, and looking also for us in terms of what would be inclusive staff forums. So we've got a couple of forums have already been set up, but what else could we do to promote cultural and ethnic inclusion within the organisation, but also address very specific issues for particular groups. So that work's been focus groups, engaging with the forums, working with Ealing directors teams, both individually as a group. So they've put all the senior management through their paces in terms of what's our understanding, what do we think are our challenges individually and within the organisation. So some of the emerging themes from that piece of work, and I apologise if we haven't come back sooner on this, got extended because there was such an interest from the workforce in across the organisation and being involved. We extended their remit, and it's taken a couple of months longer than we expected. And we've had some draft feedback from them now. So some of the emerging themes are very much about looking at the data, which I've already mentioned, but also perhaps zoning in and encouraging and making sure that particular directors look at the detail in their own service area, that we don't just do everything corporately. We really focus in, because we have some very good representation with some groups of staff but not others, so we need to understand that, and particular services need to be supported by us to really get a workforce development plan that reflects where their priorities should be around development. Clear equality targets, both at a corporate directorate and within the director's service areas. I think if we don't put some targets in, we won't make progress. We won't measure what we're doing, and we won't make progress. So I think those targets will, there might be some short-term ones, but I think this is very much a longer-term 3-year to 5-year plan for some of these things. Ensuring that internal resources are identified and aligned. We've got lots of good work going on across the council, but we really need to focus not just within HR, but across the whole organisation, within strategy and engagement. What are our roles and responsibilities in driving this agenda? DWC have come back to us with some views on governance to include a corporate equalities board. So it's possible that the existing officer inequalities group will be broadened into that equalities board, where directors, services and Pacific groups that meet are represented, and we meet on a regular basis to agree what we're focusing and what progress we're making. There's very much a desire, and we already have a workforce group set up which needs to be expanded for Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. There is a desire from the workforce that we have a group that represents people with disabilities and people in the LGBTQ plus group at a council-wide level. So that's a piece of work we'll be doing in the coming months, setting those groups up in terms of reference. The recommendation is also that we look at director equality groups. As I mentioned, we have one in children's, we have one in adult services that was set up last year, but we need, all services should have a group that looks at service-specific issues, not only just about the workforce, but also about service delivery and issues that may concern our residents. So that will be sort of, an internal, external look. And focused development for all leaders. So this is not just the senior leadership team and the directors, but all the senior leaders across the organisation, heads of service, and also sort of rolling that down to the most junior management level, making sure that people are equipped to deal with that. So next steps on that are develop our communications model. Once we've looked at who all our different stakeholders, there's a number of people that we need to talk to about this as well. We need to review and update and amend the action plan we already had, identifying short, medium and long-term actions. So that is the end of the presentation. I'm sorry I've rushed through that for you. I'm just conscious of time this evening.
Liz, this is OSC. We are used to late nights.
I know you are. At least
we may not enjoy them, but we are used to them. Thank you so much. I mean, 10 slides, but it packs an awful lot in there. So thank you very much for that summary. I've already got a couple of councillors with their hands up. So if you don't mind, we just go straight into questions.
Of course.
Councillor Crawford.
Finally. Oh, there's a horrible glare now. I'm going to turn that video off because that's not helpful for anybody. I have 3 questions, Liz, if that's okay. Thank you for a very detailed presentation. The first is around, I don't know if you can give a gut feel. It probably goes against all of everything you've just said, really. But in terms of how inclusive we are as a council and how it feels like, what it feels like we're doing at the moment, can you give us a summation of how inclusive the organisation feels and how much progress we're making? at this point. The second question is strictly on the disability side. It slightly disappoints me to see the numbers of disabled staff that we have, although I'm fully aware that, you know, this is people who are choosing to self-identify as disabled, as I understand it from that graphic. What can we do as an organisation to be more open to people with disabilities? Are there things within our recruitment? And I'm also thinking of staff who would like to progress further up the career ladder, you know, and that sort of ties in with the first question about general inclusivity. And then finally, and this is a very difficult one to answer, how are we doing in comparison with other boroughs who may be undertaking this work? Are there any neighbouring boroughs that are exemplars? Are there people who the various boards that you've spoken about are looking at as a sort of model to follow, or does it not quite work like that? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford.
Liz, do you want to take those and then we'll move on to others? Because
yeah, otherwise I'll lose track of what I've said otherwise. So inclusivity as a council and progress, I think we are making progress in some areas, but I think it needs to be a lot better. In terms of one of the things that I'm really focused on for a number of reasons, actually, particularly around recruitment, is I look at every single piece of recruitment we're doing at the moment, a bit of a challenge, but with my HR colleagues, senior colleagues, we look at recruitment because every piece is an opportunity, and we need to encourage people to offer those opportunities internally within the organisation before we consider whether we should recruit externally and whether we should look at agency staff and whether we should look at interims and, dare I mention it, consultants for those roles. So I think we are making progress in some areas. I think some managers have really got on board with this, and you know, I can see a real difference in the way they're doing their recruitment and things. I think other people have further distance to travel, but I think I have to also reflect that all those recruiting managers have also been dealing with COVID duties during this period of time. So I think, you know, hopefully as the response to COVID in some respects is not so difficult for people, we'll be able to drive forward some of that. The disability question, I think is a very interesting one, because we do have a significant number of staff that don't disclose their protected characteristics at all. We've been trying to work with the unions to help get them to encourage people to do it. I think people are anxious where the data is, but that data is only limited access by you know, a very small number of people for the right reasons. But I do think there's anxiety about putting down disabilities in particular. And I think therefore the numbers are higher than they probably seem, because when you run reports even for your own service area, your knowledge of your own service suggests that those reports there's missing information. And in terms of, we're a disability confident employer, so we do shortlist candidates. You know, candidates that have a disability, that disclose a disability, will be shortlisted if they meet the minimum criteria. So we're very proactive on the recruitment front on that side of things. We have been exploring and discussing whether we think about what's called a disability passport, where people that want to can fill in a sort of document, because some disabilities aren't obvious, particularly around mental health, and people might feel confident filling in a document about how they like to be managed, what support they might need in the workplace. It's something one of our colleagues in HR has done in another borough, and that's something that we're considering, and hopefully we'll get some time to focus on that as well. Comparison with other boroughs. So probably what I should have mentioned, and I didn't at the beginning of this, we're also, there's 2 London-wide pieces of work being done at the moment. One is looking at ethnicity of employees by pay band and service, and this is led by London councils on behalf of the chief executives. So we've had feedback, and we're just looking at that at the moment, and that identifies particularly there's 5 service areas it looks at. So it breaks up services like children's services, adult services, corporate services, technical professions, and place. So it looks at not just the whole group of staff, it breaks them down into so that you can identify particular groups of staff in particular roles. And that data has been provided by all the London councils to London Council. It's been analysed, and we've just received our feedback. So not for tonight, but I'll be coming back with when we've considered that and thought about what actions we may need to take. I'll be very happy to come back to Scrutiny to talk about that in particular. A second piece of London-wide work that's going on is tackling racial equality, sponsored by one of the chief executives, Kim Smith. And there's 3 pieces of work on that, and this has come out again from the chief executives across London to say, what do we need to do together to tackle the issues? We're all looking at the same thing, you know, to a lesser or greater extent, and what do we need, how can we work together? And there's 3 work streams on that. One is about demonstrating leadership, second is doing more together as large employers, and the third is developing and showcasing talent. I'm part of the doing more together as a large employer. So all the boroughs have been asked for volunteers to work on these working groups. They've only just started this week, so that will be emerging information later in the year. But you know, Samantha is part of the Organisational Development Network, which is hosted by London Council. So she works with colleagues across council from that perspective, and I'm part of the HR leads across council as well. So I think we're well networked into emerging themes, common issues, so that we don't reinvent the wheel. I think some boroughs are doing better than us. I think of all places, I think Bromley's doing particularly well. What stuck out for me when I've had a quick glance at the data that's just come through on this is Bromley seem doing particularly well in some areas, and so are some of our other London boroughs. And some of it is to do with the makeup of the workforce and perhaps some of the services they have, but also some of it's to do with a real sort of passion and drive to make these improvements. And I think that's probably where Ealing needs to be, to make sure we're all passionate about moving the agenda forward as we can, but doing it in a sort of planned and measured way, and actually so that we can say, yes, we did make a difference. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Liz. John, I think you're next on my list.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So the question was really, it has been touched on, but it was quite striking on the slides how the ethnic profile of the workforce is quite diverse until you get up to the grade 17, and then suddenly it drops off a cliff. So I just wondered, in terms of what, I mean, you talked about measures to when we're externally recruiting to try to get more diverse people into the very senior roles, but in terms of the internal progression, what can be done? I mean, I suppose what a helpful background would be how many jobs we're talking about that are grade 17 and above, to give a context for you know what chunk of the council it is. I think it's a fairly small number of roles, but yeah, what can be done so that people can, you know, recruit from more junior management into the top management roles, you know, maintaining the diversity we have at all those lower levels?
Of course. So ballpark figure of the number of roles in that, without looking it up right now, is there's probably 100 people within that cohort.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Possibly a few more, but definitely 100. What have we done so far? So we have been involved in some London leadership programs. So we've nominated people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds to be on those programs, and I think 2 of them being successful in moving through their career within Ealing, which is good news, although some people do choose then to move on to other boroughs. We need to do more. We need to understand more what the barriers are for them progressing, and what the, you know, but I think, you know, looking at some of the information and some of the people I've worked with, and probably Samantha's worked with, you know, it's quite often about confidence. And if people have and people do stay in Ealing quite a long time. So we do have a large chunk of the workforce that's been here, it's been their main career has been working in Ealing. And I think over a period of years, if people have gone for progression and perhaps have not been successful, maybe they don't ever apply again. Maybe that is part of the barrier, that they've had difficulties in the past. Samantha and I have been definitely talking about doing some very targeted work with these groups of people to understand and to help support them to get, whatever those barriers are, we need to understand what they are so we can support them. And I think we should always be looking internally. And sometimes I think, and I've got personal experience, so my case study for this would be within HR. When I joined in 2010, there were some really talented people within the HR community, and I was fortunate enough to end up managing some of them from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And I actually couldn't understand, they've been with the organisation a long time, why haven't they progressed? And it was because they two of them didn't feel encouraged. Nobody had actually taken the time to talk to them and understand what were the barriers, and to really support them and mentor them, and get them ready for interviews and that personal support. So I think there's something, I know Samantha's passionate about this as well as I, that's actually encouraging people. And we have seen some successes. I can look back to when I was in my previous role in supporting Alison Reynolds' area, and we put on a development program for managers, and there were definitely some really great people in there. And I know one of them has now just become a head of service. It's taken a while, but sometimes it's also, we don't always get the turnover at the senior levels, and you need sometimes for people to move on into other roles, or to, they retire or they move to another organisation before you create the opportunity. So there are less opportunities. I think there's less turnover, and that's, so when roles do come up, we really need to focus on that opportunity and how we can encourage people.
Chair, can I just come back on that?
Yeah, sure.
So I suppose two things. One is, would it be a good idea to set up a formal mentoring scheme for people, so that it's not, it's more structured across the organisation, that people in that situation, as particularly kind of employees who've been here many years, but the progression has stalled at a certain point, what can be done to overcome the barriers and get them to reach the top. And then the other thing, a bit of a curveball, but just from my experience of the officers I meet, it does seem that there are, and making this point across the organisation, not just in terms of diversity, but there are a lot of officers who've been here for many years and reached a certain point, but then there does seem to be, when the very senior jobs come up, we do seem to very often hire externally. There seems to be almost a kind of a desire for the most senior jobs to be kind of, the grass is always greener on the other side. Do you think there's a sort of cultural issue in the council that we tend to try and hire the top jobs from outside?
I'll deal with the senior jobs first, and then if Samantha's able to, I might bring Samantha in to talk about the mentoring piece, if that's all right. On the senior jobs front, I think we have had people that progress in the organisation, and we have got examples of that, where people have got into the director roles that have progressed through the organisation. And in terms of the senior leadership team, Judy Finley definitely has progressed within the organisation, and Ross has progressed, I suppose, as well. So I don't think external is always the answer. I think it's important that we do look external when it comes to senior roles as well, though. I think it's important that for the residents, and as much as anybody else, and for the organisation, that we do get the best person for the job. And I do think, there is good evidence that people have definitely progressed. Unfortunately for the organisation, some of our really good people that progress, that we might think, well, they're definitely someone for the future at the very senior level. Quite often they move, they want to get wider experience, and it's not unusual for people to move out the organisation, but we have attracted people back into the organisation at a later date. So that's probably where I am on the senior roles. With Samantha, are you able to just talk about the mentoring that we've talked about?
Yes, Liz, I can. So I think that mentoring is a really important feature to support an equalities programme. And as an organisation, we have in the past supported mentoring, and then I would say over the last few years, that's perhaps falling along the wayside. But as we are now sort of revisiting this agenda, looking at ways to address the imbalance, we're currently exploring reverse mentoring as one of the options. And with the reverse mentoring, you sort of marry up a junior member of staff from a Black and Asian minority ethnic background with a more senior white member of staff, and we support that relationship through training, if you like. But the whole premise behind that reverse mentoring is just to encourage that relationship building and encourage the senior in that relationship to champion and support the junior member of staff in their development. So that's one area that we're currently exploring. And then we're generally looking about how we can develop a coaching culture across the organisation. So as part of our new appraisal process, we're very much focused on the conversation and having a coaching type conversation. We're using particular coaching models like the GROW model to support our managers and staff's understanding of coaching generally, to help move those conversations on, to help explore individual aspirations, and then to look at, well, how can we practically support somebody who has the aspiration to become a senior person. So looking in part to how we identify future leaders and how we then use some of that information to workforce plan and move forward. So those are the things that we're currently looking at as part of our response to the equalities agenda.
Thanks, Samantha.
Okay.
Thanks. Councillor Costigan is next.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Liz and Samantha. I was going to ask a similar question to Councillor Bell about the mentoring. So glad to see him jump in there with that one. But I was a bit concerned, actually. I felt quite uncomfortable, really, with the response there, Samantha, on what you've said about the reverse mentoring. I kind of didn't really know what you meant by it. And then when you explained, it's like a white senior colleague mentoring a Black or Asian more junior colleague. Like immediately, it kind of rang alarm bells for me. And I thought, gosh, how would I feel if we were saying we were having mentoring staff where we were going to have senior male staff mentor junior women staff? And I just feel quite uncomfortable by that, actually. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. I'm not sure that that's something that I would appreciate from in terms of gender. I think it's just a bit, there's something wrong about it. It jumps out to me straight away as having something wrong about it. And really, you know, what I was going to raise around the mentoring is, I think one of the things that works a lot, you know, for Black and Asian staff in the organisation I work in, and I should put my hands up and say I work for a trade union, and it's a trade union that represents some staff in Ealing. So there's like conflict of interest, but not pecuniary. And I don't personally represent any staff in Ealing. But you know, I think that what often works is where you have peer support from other Black and Asian staff, or women staff, or LGBT staff, or disabled staff, where you can work together and support each other through things, yes, like, you know, coaching and mentoring as well. But, you know, it can actually be staff who've gone through the same things as you, and that you can have that safe space to have those discussions about, you know, moving ahead in the organisation and building confidence, because confidence, I think a couple of people have mentioned, is often key. And in my own organisation, we have training for Black and Asian staff members, like specific training, and we use the apprenticeship levy, I think, for some of this. So it's worth looking at the government's apprenticeship levy and whether that can be used. And we have the same for women staff members. But we don't have this thing where we've got kind of white people mentoring Black people in this kind of very specific way. So a bit uncomfortable with that. So the other things then I just wanted to raise was around the disability pay gap, because I know you've got published figures about the gender pay gap, which is required by law, and you've mentioned there, Liz, that there's work going on a London-wide level on the race pay, the ethnicity pay gap rather, and that's great. But I'm just wondering if any thought has gone into the disability pay gap, because, you know, I know there's pushes from various directions for, you know, both ethnicity and disability pay gaps to become statutory going forward. Who knows when that will happen? But are we looking at that ourselves and producing that kind of data and looking at, you know, how we tackle it? I know there are ways of gaming the gender pay gap, because I know you talked about you know, other councils. There's ways of gaming it, because you can basically outsource a whole load of staff. You can outsource them, and that improves your gender pay gap if there's a particular segregation issue there. But the last thing I wanted to ask about was Black staff and disciplinaries and capability procedures. Do we keep any data on that? Because it often is raised as an issue in organisations that Black staff experience, you know, sometimes find that they are more likely to be brought down the disciplinary route or the capability route. Do we keep data on that? I know the NHS, they have data that they produce for equalities groups, and they look at some of that data. And I'm wondering if that's data we look at, and that there's anything we can pull out of that and look at how those kind of formal processes to make sure that they're not kind of you know, adding to inequality in the workforce. Thanks.
Samantha, do you want to?
So shall I go? Yep, happy to clarify. So thank you very much for the challenge, Councillor Costigan. So just to sort of give a little bit more information around the reverse mentoring. So in setting up that type of arrangement, agreed principles would need to be clarified as part of the programme to support this arrangement. But also, as part of those agreed principles, there have to be very clear rules around matching staff with seniors. And so for some staff, they may elect to want to work with a female or a male, for example, but there has to be an agreed set of matching rules. And again, you know, the reverse mentoring concept is something that's been around for a while now and is being championed in a number of local authorities. I said we were looking at it, we're exploring it. We've not sort of you know, made a decision on this approach, but we're very much aware that our colleagues in boroughs such as Westminster have adopted this and currently have about 300 staff that are going through this programme. So we're really sort of trying to get some feedback from them with regards, you know, the effect and impact that it's having. But I think that one of the key premises around twinning a member of staff with a more senior is to help seniors, those senior staff, to really develop their understanding around people's lived experiences with regards equality matters. And you know, I think you're absolutely right when you say perhaps a programme of this could be extended to include other protected characteristics to help people understand issues and concerns. But the diagnostic that our colleagues DWC have undertaken have confirmed that we as an organisation could do better at supporting the progression of Black and minority ethnic staff. And as I've said, looking at the mentoring and coaching approaches is one way in which we're hoping to do that. So hopefully that sort of answers your question.
So just to add to that, it's something that firstly we're exploring, but as I'm sure you're probably aware, councillors, it's something we'd also be discussing with the trade unions as well before we made, we offered something like this. So I think we're quite good at linking in with the trade unions to discuss, the principles of some of these things as well before we'd even offer them out within the organisation. Can I just come back to the apprenticeship levy? You mentioned about the use of the apprenticeship levy. So Samantha leads on supporting the existing workforce to use the apprenticeship levy. So there's a number of programmes already running in the organisation, including management development programmes funded by this. One of the things Samantha and I have talked about is making a specific programme available for Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff funded through this, a management development programme, so they can get that peer support in a group which is inclusive to them, because we've got some wider groups which are quite representative, but there's always plenty of money in the apprenticeship levy pot. So we've talked about offering later in the year a specific programme for that group of staff as well. So that's something that we'll probably take forward anyway. Disability pay gap, I totally agree we should be looking at it. I think the focus needs to be initially on getting people to complete their data, because without getting better data on people disclosing better data to us, I don't think, it's always going to be skewed. So, but I think, yeah, we can definitely do something on that, whether it becomes, mandatory or not. On the gender pay gap, I think we're probably, as an organisation, last year because of COVID, we didn't have to publish our figures, but they're still within mid-range for London at the moment. We did look at our figures and because we've now passed the end of March, in the next couple of months, we'll be rerunning the figures to see where we are on that and what specific actions we need to take that might help improve our figures anyway. And so I think there's a very important bit about encouraging people, giving them the confidence to disclose their data, so that the work we do is reflective of the whole workforce. In terms of gathering data about casework around Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff, we have gathered data about casework in the past for the formal casework. However, it's not sat in a particular system, so we actually have it in our HR system now, which is the work we've been doing over the last months to configure the system so that it's captured within the system. Therefore, it links up and pulls through the equalities data automatically for us, and it also gives us much better oversight of what's going on and the ability to produce reports. But I do believe, and that managers are uncomfortable about having the informal conversations that perhaps they might have with their white colleagues sometimes, because there is a fear that they're going to be accused of being racist, and that might have been their experience in the past, and they might be, I think that is a concern for people, and therefore I do think there is evidence that Black staff may end up in more formal casework because nobody has actually given them that feedback, which is why the conversational practice, those regular meetings with staff is so important, about the honesty, feedback, because I think if we can get better at doing that, we will end up with less staff overall in the organisation. We don't have vast numbers, but I think we will end up with less staff getting into formal casework situations. None of us want people to be in that formal casework situation. We'd far rather things were solved informally and through line management practice. But we'll have transparency going forward, much easier to monitor and share.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Samantha. Deirdre, was there anything you wanted to come back on there? There was a lot that you asked and a lot in response.
I mean, I welcome that you're looking at doing an apprentice levy funded, you know, a separate management program that might be focused on Black and Asian staff. I definitely welcome that. There was, I'm just trying to recall the final point that you made there, which did jump out slightly. Oh yes, sorry. Just in terms of the last point about managers and Black staff. I mean, it does sound a little bit like we're blaming Black staff for the fact that they're being, you know, brought through disciplinary. So I think we maybe have to kind of think about how we frame those kind of sentiments, because it you know, it's a little bit like that sometimes.
Absolutely not blaming them. Yeah. Absolutely not blaming them. It's the confidence of line managers that is the issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that sounds good.
Absolutely, it sits with line management. It's a responsibility of line management to give feedback at the right time before things build into a situation where it ends up in a formal situation. Most things are best dealt with, through line management, informal conversations, and giving feedback, giving honest, structured feedback to people, and that's definitely a focus for developing those skills.
Thanks, Liz. And finally, Councillor Shaw.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, there's been a lot of detail in here, Liz, so thanks for this report and providing us with all this information. It's good to see this work's going on and we're making good progress on it from what I can see. But we've been talking about the staff and so on, which is great. But I'd just like to talk about the recruitment for a minute and the actual applicants and the application process. That I don't know, do we hold that sort of data that where obviously we need to move the staff through, but in the applications, are we attracting, do we know the sort of numbers that we're attracting and how that looks? To see, is there something that's putting people off in the first place? Or, you know, something that we could improve there. And also within, you know, you mentioned the sort of, for the very senior levels, the sort of executive search and recruitment, so on. That, you know, I don't know how many companies we do use, for example, doing that, and how often they get changed up. I know often in sort of a more corporate environment, you know, there might be tie-ins with one or two, and often, you know, friendly relationships are built up there, and then it's very easy just to keep going back to the same people. And so, you know, how often do we change the recruitment teams that we're using, or the outside recruitment consultancies that we're using, you know, and see if that gives us a different mix and how that might come back.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw. So on the staff application process, for all applicants that fill in their monitoring data, we've been tracking that. So some of the feedback that I gave to senior leadership team last year was that in terms of attracting applicants, we didn't look by role profile, but we looked white versus Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. So we get a very good representation of applicants coming through, applying for jobs. Many of them convert through to being interviewed, but in terms of actually being appointed to roles, there is a greater number of white people appointed to the roles. So that is a big piece of work. So we've got all the detail of that, and that is something that's going to be broken down for each director. We've got all the data going back for 4 years, so that we can start to zone in on, is it particular roles, is it, you know, what is it in those areas where people are not being, is it across the whole council, or the particular pockets of that? Because people are trained in that, and so people, you know, people are getting through the interview to an interview, but they're not always as successful as their white applicants. So we do have the data, and that's something that's going to take some time to unpick to a level at which we can really focus in on. And as part of that, we're going to start auditing, looking at the shortlisting and recruitment panels and actually what the outcomes are. So we're going to start randomly picking some of the campaigns to have a look at, and actually just seeing, is there anything else? But we do have the historic data as well, and we'll be particularly looking for the last 2 years, what that pattern is, to see if there's, you know, if there's a pattern we can change there. From the executive search side of things, we're part of, in terms of headhunters, We generally use, we're part of the London recruitment partnership, so it's been pre-procured. I think there's 6 or 8 organisations on there. So when we're going out to recruit for sort of assistant director, senior posts, etc., we normally send the brief out to all of them, and then we normally pick one organisation to work with us. I think you are right to challenge us on, is it always the same organisation? Quite often it's the same 2 or 3, I would suggest, because of their range of experience and their ability in the past to bring us diverse candidates through that process. But I'm happy to keep exploring it. And for the first time, you know, this has been a challenge to me before about how we choose our headhunters. I mean, I don't have a particular vested interest because none of them recruited me, so I don't have any loyalties in that position, I think. But what I would say is that normally the technical interviews for these roles and that is done with the headhunters and someone from another borough or someone senior within Ealing. And in this case, both the exec director recruitment that we're doing at the moment, both Gary Alderson, who's the interim exec director, who's not applying for the post, and myself are part of the interview process. So we're at long listing stage, and Gary and I are doing interviews as well as technical interviews being done by the headhunter and a specialist from another borough at a very senior level. So I think one of the important things is, you know, that I discuss with the chief executive is I intend to be part of that recruitment process to make sure that, you know, we don't, you know, that we encourage we look really carefully at all the applicants that have come through, that we get good long lists and we get good short lists. And, you know, I think it's important to be part of that process myself as well now.
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Liz. I think that information about the interviews stage raises something of an alarm bell, because if we're managing to shortlist people on an anonymous interview application form, and then when we interview them, when we meet them, we then say no, actually, and we kind of tend towards a wider cohort of successful candidates. I think we really need to look at that. And maybe think about interview practice. I don't know what our kind of panel rules are. I know where I work, the rules are that we must have at least one woman and there's someone from outside the team as well. So you don't just have kind of an insular team recruiting to itself. You have outside input as well. So I don't know if that's something that you want to look at as well.
Definitely something we do. We look for diverse teams, and you know, we have had a change of practice in some areas. So I've challenged people a few times about you haven't got anyone from outside your service. So some of and particularly for the management roles, we've encouraged services, and they have been doing it, and I've done it in my own service, to actually have 2 panels. So it's not unusual now for us to have a panel where we look at technical skills. So when I was recruiting to the head of corporate health and safety, I actually didn't do the technical skills interviews myself. I had people in Mark Wiltshire's area and from within HR elsewhere, and another manager do that part of the process. And then Samantha actually worked with me on this one. Samantha, myself, and a director from another service did a sort of more cultural fit and values and behaviours type interview. And then we pulled the information from both interviews together to decide on, you know, to appoint a successful candidate. And I think sometimes we try and squash people through one panel in possibly an hour and a half with 3 people on it. I don't think, you know, applicants, it's really hard when you're filling in applications. And I think, you know, that process it needs to be better. So it's not unusual now, and we're really be encouraging that sort of, where it's appropriate, that double interview process. I think the feedback we've had is the candidate gets a better experience because, you know, they've got time to prove who they are, and we've got a better time to assess their skills from a number of facets.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Borowska, a final question, then we should probably move on, because it is approaching 9:30.
That's all right, I'm fine.
Thank you. Liz, I have to say, yeah, that was quite a sort of a data and info packed presentation, one to reread several times, I think, just to actually get to the crux of certain things. I'm looking at sort of the wider scope of the council in terms of the data that you have. And
you've muted yourself, Joanna.
All of that, I said. Silence. I was also...
And again, Joanna. Well, third time lucky.
There you go. Yeah, can you hear me? Yay.
Yes, Councillor, I can hear you.
I've never been that quiet, probably. I have to say that I was saying to Liz that the presentation was quite informative, and one that actually should be reread several times as time goes by to see what's working and what isn't. As for example, Councillor Costigan raised the reverse mentoring, which I too had concerns, and actually I thought, oh, my ears perked up to think, how does this work? How will people feel actually on both sides of the dialogue? And I was looking at sort of what other councillors raised and looking at a wider picture of not just council-owned companies who are not necessarily recruited by yourselves, but those who are wearing the Ealing badge, the Ealing Council badge. And I think that'd be interesting because as the sort of the business modelling or organisational modelling changes over the time, over decades, how does the Ealing sort of way forward about equality and eliminating inequalities feed through to, say, the council-owned, for example, council-owned companies, but also, for example, in the sort of the school arena, you know, so the wider, and also those who are outsourced. So, for example, Kingdom, we use Kingdom for enforcement. You know, do we know their statistics? I'm not saying that we need to influence them, but we need to see who we actually are procuring as a service. What are their inequalities criteria? And I think, or equality criteria. Do we have? I'm trying to remember last time I actually sat on a procurement, for example, scrutiny, where do we have a criteria where we request to see their equalities assessment, for example, and maybe split some? I appreciate some work are manual and some are non-manual. I appreciate, you know, that there will be a gender, for example, disparity there in certain tasks. So it'd be interesting to see at the wider scope of Ealing, those who are fall under are sort of and wear the Ealing uniform effectively.
Okay, so briefly, Councillor, council-owned companies, Greener Ealing Limited, I'm sure we could get the data from them. We have a very close working relationship with them, and you know, and as you're probably aware, you know, the expectation is council-owned companies certainly pay London Living Wage. Broadway Living we'll have the data on Broadway Living, but that's, you know, a small group of staff perhaps. In terms of but I think it's important, the principles, and because in terms of governance, the council does have a role in terms of governance, being on boards and things for the council-owned companies. And I think I certainly know from talking to the chief executive that he's very keen that the principles of what we're trying to do within Ealing Council are applied in Ealing council-owned companies, definitely. In terms of schools, it's an interesting relationship because from an HR perspective, the schools don't all buy into our services and they don't all use our systems. So certainly, and this has come up at Council and Trade Union Joint Committee as well, we encourage schools through, we have an HR schools consultancy team that works within my area. So where schools buy into our HR services, we're quite proactive in sharing all the good practice things we're doing. but schools are sort of very independent, so we don't actually have much of their data, to be quite honest. But we certainly look at the school staff, the support staff that are on Ealing contracts, we do have more information on, and we do things in terms of, we make sure we use the same job evaluation system for their roles and things. So definitely more on schools, but it's not so transparent for us, not so easy to get. And in terms of outsourcing and other contractors, we do have joint contracts board now, which is chaired by Ross Brown, and all contracts coming up for let go for that board, most directors go to those board meetings, and I think we all have quite a keen interest on who we're letting contracts to, but it is the individual services, so it's something we probably need to come back on. I haven't been involved in a large procurement recently, but certainly when I was last involved in a large procurement, one of the criteria that I was actually asked to look at was what was their equalities data, what was their equalities policies, and also what was their commitment to doing things like taking on apprentices, another really important thing for the council.
Thank you. No, that's important to those who wear a badge to effectively feel they are being equally represented. Thank you.
Of course.
Great, thank you, Liz, Samantha. Thank you so much. Firstly for waiting to get there, but also for the report and taking the questions. I think you probably tell it is something that OSC does have some interest in. So this is probably a really useful kind of first discussion on this piece. So as your work progresses, we'll probably kind of suggest that it remains on our work programme and that we come back to it and ask about progress, I think, on all those areas that are in the presentation. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll leave you in peace. Good night.
Speaking of work programme, it does take us on to our work programme item. And the main bit we need as a committee to decide this evening is the 4 topics for next year's scrutiny panels. There are 2 appendices. There are also some additional suggestions from members of the public in the briefing note. I don't know if anyone has some suggestions on the kind of ones they particularly want to go forward, because there are quite a lot of them. Councillor Ball, you put your video on. I'm assuming you want to chip in.
Oh well, yeah. I was just a video on to show general interest, but yeah, I think the one that as you've got in the papers, there were a few from the Lib Dem group, but a couple of them have already been ruled out for other reasons. So the one that was left from the Lib Dem group was, I marked it in here on my traditional old-fashioned paper copy, resident engagement. That's right. So I mean, I think that would be, so it came out of the Labour group and the Lib Dem group. I think there is a perception that, and in fact it was actually mentioned in the earlier item in the context of Fisher's Lane, that sometimes the way that the council engages with the public, both in terms of normal business and in terms of new schemes and changes, could be improved. So I think that would make sense. And there's quite a lot of different aspects of it. So it's the sort of thing that you could have a meeting. Well, yeah, you could have a meeting about how it engages with each of several different groups and so on. So yeah, I think that's sensible.
Thanks. I think I probably agree. I mean, it also comes from the Labour group as well, so I would not be against that. So I think we can put that down as one. I think Councillor Driscoll, your climate emergency one. Ah, there you are. Look, as if by magic.
Yes.
Has been going well. I don't know if you're supportive of continuing that one.
I mean, because the emergency strategy came through in January, and it is designed to develop over several years, and several strands are at a very early stage and coming through. So there's opportunity for pre-scrutiny, which is probably doesn't happen as often as it might do in some cases. So that's still there. Just while I'm talking, there is the agile scrutiny suggestion, which is is a bit of a cop-out. If you're looking for councillors to express an interest in an area that they're going to be undertaking some work in and contributing to the development in, having a topic with a title would help to stimulate some interest, rather than something so amorphous that you don't know what you're going to be looking at. Having said that, I did chair Leone, local effects on national issues. However, that was really targeted on funding for councils, universal credit, which was massive in its impact, and housing changes in legislation. So while it might have had an overarching theme, it was very tangible in what it was looking at. So I'm a bit critical, well, a lot critical of a title of Agile, because it's just not allowing consistency, and it doesn't attract interest from councillors to who wants to be on that panel. There we go. Thank you.
Thanks. Deirdre and then Sarah.
Thanks, Chair. It was just in terms of the suggestion around looking at a poverty strategy, because this came out of this year's COVID panel. And at our first meeting, what we talked about really was kind of the post-pandemic landscape, and really looking at some of the inequalities that the pandemic laid bare. And looking at how we could work on those going forward. And the suggestion actually came from Southall Community Alliance, who came to our first meeting. And the things that they were thinking of were, you know, looking at practical areas like financial inclusion, for example. You know, so not just it wouldn't be like kind of covering some of the equalities work that the Race Commission, for example, are looking at the moment. It would be more about kind of poverty in general, and a kind of cross section of different approaches that we could take to that, and looking at what the council currently does, and then what we might do in the future, like looking at jobs, because I think jobs is going to be a big issue post-pandemic as well. So it was poverty strategy, but it was poverty strategy in the context of COVID. And I think, you know, this year's COVID panel was meant to sort of look at post-COVID, but it turned out we never had post-COVID. We've been in the middle of COVID all year, so we haven't had a chance to do that, and it's been a much lighter touch scrutiny than it should have been. So I'd kind of put in a plug for doing that, but it's not just kind of standalone poverty strategy, as I say, it's a post-COVID kind of thing. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from Councillor Costigan's point, and also I was going to say I agree with Councillor Driscoll's point about the title of Agile Scrutiny. I think it needs to be a little bit more specific. But I was just wondering, just a suggestion is that instead of Agile Scrutiny, could we do a COVID recovery panel, and then that can the topic of it, or like the focus of it, could change each meeting. So it would be quite similar to the Agile Scrutiny panel, but it would have more of a focus in terms of COVID recovery, and like Councillor Costigan said about the poverty, looking into poverty in the borough, how we can help businesses post-COVID.
Yeah, I think one of the things we'll probably find is anything we discuss will be in the next year will be COVID recovery influence in some way. But I think that's a better way of doing a kind of a wider panel than the Agile title. Any other thoughts, suggestions on a set of 4 topics? So I think we've got 4 suggestions so far, I think, in environment, the engagement, the poverty strategy, and a COVID recovery. Were there any other suggestions? I know there was coming out of one of them, the children's mental health piece that came from a couple of places as well, about how that might impact as well. But
Chair, if I may.
Yes, Dan.
So I think the 4 suggestions are very solid, actually, in terms of being substantive pieces of work that would lend themselves to not elongated scrutiny, but over a set of scheduled meetings. They'd give each panel quite a bit to get their teeth into. I wonder if some of the other suggestions, like the one that you've just referenced, they might form part of the work programme or items for this particular panel where appropriate. When I say this particular panel, I mean not this meeting now, but overview and scrutiny as it goes forward. Obviously, that's for your discretion, but some of those other suggestions seem suited to at least initially a one-off meeting that can assess something in depth and then decide whether it needs greater investigation, if you like.
Okay, so to have the COVID recovery that picks up various topics.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear.
Sorry, you know, I'm just making sure just that.
Yeah, I think there are 4 solid suggestions that come through from what's there, but there are other suggestions in the whole thing that have some merit to them, but probably not as standalone panels, if you see what I'm saying. There are, you know, children's mental health, and some of that is a very difficult, knotty issue, but it's something that you could sit down with an exec director and say, you know, is there scope for us to have a detailed presentation on this at overview and scrutiny, and we could devote some overview and scrutiny time to it, because that gives it the platform of a major committee and the opportunity for you to direct follow-up. Whereas you know, it's a difficult one to fit across a full panel's year-long span, if you like.
Okay, Deirdre.
I mean, I do wonder if we ought to give children's mental health, you know, more time, because I think this is the big problem with mental health. It's, you know, it's the Cinderella service, it's always said, and time again, this is what happens. We ignore mental health, we put it to one side. COVID has, you know, purportedly shown how important mental health is. There's meant to be this huge big focus on it, but again and again, I think we just neglect it. And you know, actually, children's mental health is something that, weirdly enough, does come up on the doorstep. I've actually had residents in Northolt say to me, "This is terrible. My child is having to wait 2 years to actually get an appointment with CAMHS." And I mean, I wonder if it is actually something that, in fact, a scrutiny panel could finally do something about. As Councillor Crawford said, it is a very knotty issue. And I'm wondering if actually that's exactly what a scrutiny panel might work well with, a very knotty issue where we start to understand where the problems in the system are. And I actually heard our local MP speak about it the other day, where he's been doing some work trying to identify where the issues are. So it is on, you know, the agenda, and it is something that others are looking at, and it might actually be an area where we could, you know, finally make some progress, and scrutiny might have some really useful options to put forward. So I'm wondering if the kind of COVID poverty strategy one could be amalgamated, and we because the poverty strategy stuff, like I say, a lot of it comes out of COVID, really. They're both very much related. So, you know, it could be, you know, COVID recovery and poverty strategy, or, you know, I'm sure there's a way we can phrase it that makes that work. But I wonder if there's a way we can kind of amalgamate those and still do children and adolescent mental health, because I think it is actually a really important area, and this is the moment really where we're suddenly saying we care about mental health. So if we don't do it now, I don't know when we will.
Okay, Sarah, and then I know Sam wants to come in on something as well. Sarah, sorry.
Thank you, and I think that's a really good point that Councillor Costigan made. I just wanted to say as well about the other suggestion of the digital services and in terms of digital exclusion, which I think has the topic of that has been raised over the past year due to the pandemic and with some people not having access to technology. So could that maybe go under the COVID recovery panel as well, I think, because I think that will definitely be something that we should discuss in more detail.
Yeah, or the resident engagement one, the ways we engage digitally and have learned to over the years this year, probably more than anything. Sam. Oh, Sam has
dropped off. And
Sam has
Simon's
dropped
now
off.
The host.
We have no democratic services with us at all.
He's dropped off.
We are entirely self-reliant here, which is excellent.
Chair,
but
if I may,
no
whilst
one
we're
taking
waiting,
minutes.
Chair.
Sorry, I think, John, did you want to come in?
No, I was just being facetious. I just said it's a brave new world having to cope on our own.
Well, I'll nominate you to take minutes then, John. Joanna.
Yeah, I just wanted to, whilst we're waiting for Sam to get back, Councillor Rooney mentioned about digital exclusion. Actually, just for FYI for the public and for the panel, in the last meeting of the Agile Scrutiny this municipal year, we'll be discussing digital exclusion in terms of engagement with, for example, council meetings. So we can discuss that aspect of digital exclusion. In terms of interacting with the council.
Yeah, I'm just trying to drop Sam a message actually, because I think we may need him to record our decision this evening. But in my mind, I think we've got the climate emergency, resident engagement, poverty strategy with a kind of COVID recovery angle, and then the children's and adolescents' mental health. Does that kind of reflect what we've just discussed? I can see Deirdre nodding, but no one else. Sam Sam is connecting to audio. I think he has just rejoined us. Sam, welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry, I missed everything from Councillor Costigan talking about the combining the poverty strategy and COVID recovery, and leading up to the children's mental health and wellbeing. I caught all of that, and then it just dropped.
It's all on YouTube. You can catch up at your leisure.
If I may, Chair, I thought I'd just mention, if it's the opportune moment, about Agile Scrutiny, because that's sort of been mentioned. I think what's been suggested is a good idea, giving it a bit more of a theme. I think we can't be forgetting, though, that the sort of principles behind why we're doing it, if we put aside the name and you know what we've done this year, and that is that it was supposed to be a panel that didn't produce a final report, but was able to make recommendations along the way, sort of each time a subject was considered. So if we have a topic that suits itself to that, then by all means we should do that. But the reason for that was it was part of the review of scrutiny we undertook last year, I think it was. And the reason for that was to sort of balance the workloads and things of the scrutiny officers, so that there wasn't an expectation to create a massive, great big final report for all four panels, just to recognise the reduction in resources that we've had, but ensuring that we can continue having a strong scrutiny function. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. If we can find a topic that does that and meets that those sort of requirements, then I think that's great. So yeah, I thought that just add that in there. And was there anything I missed from the other two contributions that I need to be aware of? Sorry.
I'm not sure there is, in terms of, if you'd caught the bit about amalgamating poverty with the recovery angle and the children's and adolescents' mental health, you've probably caught it all. I mean, you know, I would say I think it's probably then down to chairs. If we were to go with those four, it might be that those panels can, if we were looking at the climate emergency, they could look at a specific single area, make some recommendations, and then move on to another area, for instance. So I think we could, you know, approach things differently, and just because we don't have a kind of agile topic means that we don't have to approach things in an agile manner. I've got Miriam, John, and then Gareth.
Oh. Thank you, Chair. I had spoken extensively before about transport on a previous meeting, so I wasn't quite sure if it would really be in order for me to speak again on that. But I don't know if that's at all possible, if that could just join the list, just in terms of the fact that I have discussed it before, but I don't necessarily want to bore everybody by repeating the same thing again. So
we can add it to the list. I think the feeling was that you know, we will. I'm sure OSC will be looking at some aspects of transport, shall we say, in the next 6 months or so, and it's something we did have 2 years worth of panels on. So I just don't know whether it's time yet to go back to it. Right. I think John was next, then Gareth.
Yeah, I mean, it's just responding to Sam. I'm not sure whether perhaps perhaps some of the work in the COVID recovery group might be due to the fast changing nature of the topic. It might be kind of things where there was a kind of an immediate recommendation for things rather than it all necessarily going in a big report. So I don't know if Sam's looking for, I don't know, it's not particularly helpful because it's not the whole work of that panel, but some aspects of that might perhaps not be producing as much text for a big report as the other ones maybe.
Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just coming in, I know that Sam did just mention concerns about final reports and so on, and that was, part of the review of Scrutiny, as I recall it, was about sort of changing that up and looking for leaner, more concise reporting and the recommendations coming out of panels as well. That previously, we have had a lot of detail, which is good, but we were looking for a lot sharper, perhaps, and finer analysis and action points that we can really sort of focus on looking forward.
Thanks. I don't have anyone else left, so I think then, if there are no strong objections, we're going with climate emergency, a continuation, resident engagement, poverty strategy with a view that it's kind of COVID recovery worked into there, and then the children's and adolescents mental health panel. No one is shouting out that that's not what we've agreed, so I will suggest that.
Can you repeat again? Sorry.
Climate emergency. Resident in my notes say ngugumur because my handwriting is terrible, but it's resident engagement, poverty strategy with the COVID recovery angle, and children's and adolescents mental health. There are lots of nods, no one saying no, so I think we can put those down, which takes us only to our next.
Garrett's got his hand
up.
Oh,
I think he's just not taking it down.
Okay.
He's one of those, Dan, which I think takes us
my fault
to our next item, which is date of the next meeting, which is the 13th of May.
Chair, before we
Dan.
Before we go, I'm not sure if this is the last meeting of the municipal year. It probably isn't if we've got one on the 13th of May. Well, 13th. If it is, I do think.
Yes, it is before annual council, isn't it?
Yeah. So I do think it is tradition that we pass a vote of thanks to the chair for his sterling work over the past year, and with the agreement of colleagues, I'd like to do that now. I might be out of order, but I'm sure you can indulge me for that.
I'm not going to rule that out of order, Dan. Don't worry. Thank you very much. I mean, I think if we don't have any call-ins from April, the May meeting is one of the ones that will be cancelled. Sam is nodding, so hopefully this is the last meeting. So thank you very much, Dan.
Yes. I'll second that then. Provisionally, unless we have a call-in meeting.
He's just going to call it in now.
I can do it by myself. Maybe I will. But thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for your time this year. And I'm sure some of you will be here next year after annual council, and we will see who that is after annual council. Thank you very much, and hopefully not see you on the 13th of